Hey there and welcome back. If the day is done with you at last, and the light is low, and there is nothing more that anybody needs from you tonight, then let yourself go soft into the pillow and come with me somewhere warm and very far away. We are going to Italy this evening, 500 years ago, into the hottest, loudest, most beautiful and most dangerous city in the world, and we are going to spend the night with a woman whose name you already know. You have been told about her since you were a child. The poisoner, the woman with the hollow ring who tipped powder into the wine at her father's dinner parties and watched the guests go grey. The Pope's daughter who did the unimaginable with her father and her brother and helped them murder half of Rome. That is the story, and it has been told for 5 centuries in operas and novels and paintings and every film anybody ever made about that family. And here is the thing I want to say to you before we go a single step further. The ring does not exist. It never existed. There is no poisoning anywhere in the record that can be laid at her door, not one. And every single charge against her was invented by men who had reasons. And we know their names, and we know what the reasons were. What actually happened to her is this. She was sold at 13. She was sold again at 18. And the second husband, whom she loved, was stabbed on the steps of a church and then killed in a bed she had been sitting beside for a month, on her own brother's order, while she was in the next room. She was sold a third time at 21, to a family who spat her name in a city that lined the road to look at the whore of Rome. And she died there at 39, and the whole of that city closed its shops and wept. Before we go back to any of it, let me say that if these long evenings are a comfort to you, you are very welcome to follow along, and then the next one will find its way to you when you would like the company. And if you feel like it, do tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, because I do love reading them. There is something rather fitting in the thought of a woman who was talked about by the whole of Europe, who never once got to give her own account of anything, being kept company tonight by so many people in so many quiet rooms, who have come to hear what she was actually like. But nothing at all is asked of you now, only that you let your hands unclench and let the day go and come with me into the heat. Picture this. It is June, and it is Rome, and the heat comes up off the stones at you like the breath of an oven. The Tiber is low and brown, and it smells. There are pigs in the streets and ruins with washing strung between them, and cardinals going past on mules under silk canopies, and half the alleys are so narrow that you could touch both walls at once. And up on the hill there is a palace, newly painted, full of Spaniards, where a 13-year-old girl with hair down past her knees is being dressed for her wedding by 200 people, and her father, who is the Pope, is somewhere in that building deciding which of the powers of Italy he is going to hand her to. She has been engaged twice already to 2 different men, and she is 13. Neither of them ever came for her. This one will, before we go anywhere near her life, I want to take the accusations apart, one at a time, in front of you, because otherwise the whole evening will be watched through them, and that is exactly what the men who wrote them wanted. There are 4 charges: poison, relations with her father, relations with her brother, and a supper party in the Vatican that has been famous for 500 years. Let us do them in order. The poison first, because it is the famous one. The hollow ring is a 19th century invention. That is the whole answer. It appears in the 1800s, in novels and in an opera, and there is nothing behind it. Not a single account from her lifetime, not one hostile ambassador, not one enemy, ever says that Lucrezia Borgia poisoned anybody. And her enemies wrote a very great deal indeed, and they were not shy, and if there had been the smallest scrap of it, they would have used it. Now, was there poisoning in that world? Yes, there is a substance that comes up over and over, called cantarella, and the Borgias were widely believed to use it. And cardinals did have a tendency to die at exactly the moment when their estates would have been useful to the papacy. Her father and her brother are genuinely under suspicion for some of that, and I am not going to defend them because they were not defensible. But look what happened. She was standing next to them. And a woman standing next to a crime in that century or any other is the person the story attaches itself to, because it is the version people want. A murderous pope is a political fact and rather dull. A beautiful blonde girl of 19 with a ring full of powder is a story, and it sells, and it has been selling for 500 years. Second charge, relations with her father. We know exactly where this comes from to the month, and we know who said it and why, and it is one of the pettiest things in the history of Europe. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, was being got rid of. The Borgias no longer needed Milan, and so they wanted the marriage annulled, and the ground they chose was that he was impotent, and that the marriage had never been consummated in 4 years. Think about what they were asking a man of that century to do. Stand up, in public, in front of Italy, and sign a document saying that he could not perform. It was the most complete humiliation available. He refused for months. His own family told him to take the deal. And when he finally signed, he went away and said the thing that would hurt them most, which was that the Pope wanted his daughter for himself, and that was the real reason. That is where it comes from. A furious, frightened, publicly emasculated man in the moment of his humiliation, reaching for the worst thing he could think of. He offered no evidence. He never repeated it in any formal setting. He simply said it, and it went round Italy in a week, because it was delicious, and it has never stopped going round since. Third charge, relations with her brother. This one has no source at all in her lifetime that is not either the same Sforza slander or the diplomatic dispatch of somebody who had heard the Sforza slander. There is one hostile letter from a Venetian retailing gossip. That is it. That is the entire evidentiary basis for a story that has produced 10 operas, 30 novels, and a television series. What is true is that they were extremely close. He was 2 or 3 years older than her. They had been raised together. They wrote to each other constantly. And when she was in trouble, he came. And when she was in Ferrara, and he was falling apart in Spain, the letters between them are the letters of 2 people who only ever really had each other. He was also, in the flattest possible terms, the man who had her second husband killed. Read that again. The great romance of the Borgia legend is a woman and the brother who murdered the man she loved. If you want to know what she actually felt about Cesare, the evidence is in what she did after that murder, which was to leave Rome and go to a castle 60 miles away and shut the door. Fourth, the supper. There was a party in the Vatican in the autumn of 1501, and something happened at it, and it was reported by the Pope's own master of ceremonies in his private diary. And what he describes is a dinner with women brought in for the entertainment of the men and prizes given, and it was, by any standard, a squalid evening. The reason everybody knows about it is that the diarist says Lucrezia was there watching. He is our only source. He was a fussy, disapproving German who hated the Borgias and hated the Spaniards and was writing privately, and he had not attended, and half the entry is what somebody told him. She was 21, a fortnight from her 3rd wedding, and the entire Italian diplomatic corps was in Rome watching her every movement for the Ferrara negotiation, and not one ambassador mentions it. Not one. In a fortnight, when a Ferrarese envoy was writing home about the colour of her sleeves. So here is where I come out on all 4, and then we can go and meet her. Every charge against Lucrezia Borgia traces back to one of 3 sources: a man she divorced, a family who wanted her family's lands, or a diarist with a grudge. Not one of them produced a shred of evidence at the time. Her own father's enemies, who had the resources of 2 nations and every reason to destroy her, could find nothing to accuse her of except being related to him. And here is the thing that ought to settle it, and it is very simple. She went to Ferrara at 21, with all of this attached to her name. That court had fought against the marriage for a year. Her father-in-law had haggled over her like a horse and had spies in her household. Her sister-in-law was the cleverest woman in Italy and could not stand her. She spent 17 years in that city, watched by people with all the motive on earth to catch her at something. And they found nothing. In 17 years, nothing. She did the work, all of it, for 17 winters in front of them, and when she died, the ambassador who had been sent to spy on her wrote home that a city was in mourning and that he had never seen anything like it. The Ferrarese archive is the best character witness any woman of that century ever had, and it says the same thing on every page, which is that she was decent, capable, extremely hard-working, and rather sad. Now let us go back to the beginning, and to the man who made all of it, because you cannot understand a single thing about her without understanding her father, and he is the most charming monster in this entire history. Rodrigo Borgia was the most charming man in Rome for 4 decades, and he bought the papacy in a single night in the August of 1492, and he was, by every account including the hostile ones, a wonderful father. That last sentence is the one that makes this whole story difficult, and I am not going to make it easy. Start with where he came from, because it explains the thing everybody misses, which is that the Borgias were foreigners. They were Spanish. Valencian. The family name in Spain is Borja, and they had come to Italy in the train of his uncle, who had become pope in the 1450s as Calixtus III, and who had done what the popes of that century all did, which was to pull his relatives up after him. So Rodrigo was made a cardinal at 25 by his uncle, and vice-chancellor of the church at 26, and he then sat in the machinery of the papacy for 35 years, under 5 popes running the administration, learning where every single body was buried, and getting extremely rich. And the Italians never accepted him. Not for one day in 50 years. He was the Catalan, the Spaniard, the outsider. His Italian had an accent. His household spoke Valencian. His relations came over in shiploads and got jobs. Every ounce of hatred that ever attached itself to that family has a thread of that running through it. And when you read the invective against Lucrezia, you are reading, among other things, Italians being disgusted by Spaniards. Now the man himself. He was enormous fun, hold on to that, because it is why he won. He was big and warm and physically vigorous into his 70s, and he had the quality that certain politicians have of making the person in front of him feel like the only person in the world. A contemporary said that he attracted beautiful women as a magnet attracts iron. He was witty at the dinner table. He was generous. He was almost never angry. He was also a working professional of the first rank. He knew canon law inside out. He was the best administrator in Europe. He could hold a consistory of cardinals in his hand. When Rome was in chaos, which it always was, he was the man who could actually make it work, and everybody knew it, including the people who loathed him. And he had children, openly, which was not remotely unusual, and which he did with a kind of joyful shamelessness that was. Vanozza de Catane was his mistress for the best part of a decade, and gave him 4 children who mattered: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Joffre. He did not hide them. He did not pretend they were nephews, which was the polite convention. He acknowledged them, promoted them, married them off, cried over them, and boasted about them. There is a papal bull legitimizing his daughter that says, in effect, "This is my child," and the affection was real. That is what makes it awful. Read the letters. He fusses. When she is ill, he cannot function. When she was in Ferrara, and there were reports of a difficult pregnancy, the Pope of Rome was, by the account of the ambassadors, unable to attend to business. He wrote to her constantly. He gave her a palace next to his own so that he could see her. When he was away from Rome twice, he left her in charge of opening his correspondence. There is a story of Lucrezia Borgia at 19 sitting in the Vatican with the Pope's letters in front of her and a cardinal beside her to advise, which caused a scandal that has never quite been believed, but which is in the record. So, he loved her, genuinely and demonstrably, and he sold her 3 times. That is the whole of Lucrezia Borgia's life in one sentence, and there is no way round it. The man who adored her, who could not eat when she was sick, who cried in public when she left Rome, married her at 13 to a man of 26 because he needed Milan, unmarried her at 17 by making her swear in front of a room of men that she was untouched, married her at 18 to a boy of 17 because he needed Naples, and then stood by while her brother had that boy strangled because they had decided to have France instead. He did not think there was any contradiction. That is the part that is genuinely hard for us. To Rodrigo Borgia, a daughter was a piece of the family's fortune, and using her was not a betrayal of his love for her. It was what love looked like, because the family was everything, and the family's rise was what he was for. He would have said, and probably did say, that he had made her a duchess, that she had jewels, that she was a great lady in Italy because of him, and he was, in the narrow sense, right. And she went to Ferrara and never came home, and he died 3 years later, and she was not there. Now the papacy, and then we will go and find her. The conclave of August 1492 is one of the great scandals of church history, and there is no serious dispute about what happened. He bought it. Money and offices moved to cardinals, and there is a famous image of 4 mule loads of silver going to the house of one of them, and by the morning he had the votes. It was not unusual to grease a conclave, that the scale was unusual, and the openness was, and the fact that everybody knew, and that the Italians never let him forget it, because he was a Spaniard who had bought St. Peter's chair. He was Pope for 11 years. He was, in some ways, a good one administratively, and in the ways that matter he was a disgrace, and he did not care. And on the day it happened, his daughter was 12 years old, and her value on the marriage market of Italy went up by an order of magnitude overnight, and every prince in the peninsula started writing letters. She was 12. Before we go and find her, come out into the streets with me for a moment, because I have not yet shown you the city she was standing in, and it is nothing whatever like the one in your head. I want to spend a chapter on the city, because we have been talking about politics, and I have not yet given you the place she actually lived in, and Rome in the 1490s is not what the word Rome puts in your head. Forget the marble, forget the domes. St. Peter's as you picture it does not exist yet. It is a crumbling 1,000-year-old basilica with a tilt in it and props holding up the wall. There is no great piazza. Michelangelo is a teenager in Florence. What is actually there is a town of about 50,000 people living in the wreckage of a city built for 1 million. That is the thing to hold. Rome was a ruin with people camping in it. That place had held 1 million souls and had aqueducts and baths and marble everywhere, and it had fallen, and the water had stopped, and by her century there were 50,000 people huddled in the bend of the river, in the low ground, because that is where the water was. So the great monuments are out in the fields. The Colosseum is a quarry, with families living in it, and there are cattle grazing in the Forum, and it was called the cow field for centuries, because that is what it was, a meadow with columns sticking out of it and cows on it. The baths of Caracalla are a hill with vines. Half the churches of Rome are held up by pillars carted out of the ruins, and half the palaces are built out of them. They burned the ancient marble for lime, and there were lime kilns going in the middle of the ruins, turning the classical world into mortar. And in among that, the streets, narrow, unpaved, filthy, pigs everywhere, because everybody kept pigs and let them out to scavenge, and the pigs were the sanitation. No drains worth the name. The Tiber flooded every few years and drowned the low quarters and left mud and worse in the ground floors. And then the fever came in the summer. The fever is the whole background of this evening. Rome in July and August was a killing ground. The marshes round it bred it, and the papal court fled the city in summer if it possibly could. And if you could not get out, you took your chances. It killed her father. It nearly killed her brother in the same week. It is in every letter anybody wrote from that city. The air is bad, get out. And through all of it, pilgrims, that is what the whole place was for. Where to? It ran on visitors, and in the Jubilee year of 1500, right in the middle of everything we have been talking about, 200,000 of them came into a town of 50,000, and every inn was full, including, I have no doubt, the inns belonging to a certain innkeeper called Vanozza dei Catane, who was doing extremely well that year while her son murdered her daughter's husband. Sit with that. Her mother's business had its best season in the same summer that Alfonso was strangled. Now the danger, because it was not metaphorical. Rome had no police worth the name. The great families ran it. Orsini, Colonna, the rest, and they hated each other on a hereditary schedule. And they had private armies and fortified towers in the middle of the city, and they fought each other in the streets. When a pope died, Rome rioted, without fail, as a kind of custom. The mob went for the dead pope's family and his household and his palace. And the interregnum was a licensed carnival of violence until the new man was chosen. That is what everybody in the Borgia household knew was coming for them, the moment Rodrigo's heart stopped, and it is exactly what happened. Bodies in the river were ordinary. That is the sentence I need you to have. When Juan Borgia was pulled out of the Tiber in 1497 with 9 wounds in him, they questioned a boatman who had been on the bank, and the man said he had seen a body dumped, and he was asked why on earth he had not reported it, and he said, in words that have come down to us almost intact, that he had seen 100 bodies go into that river at that spot and nobody had ever cared before. 100 bodies. That was the answer of an ordinary working man about the ordinary state of things. That is her city. That is what she was raised in, and it is the missing piece in every version of her story, because the modern imagination puts the Borgias in a marble palace with candles and poison and a chess game, and the truth is a hot, stinking, malarial, half-ruined town of 50,000 people, with pigs in the alleys and cows in the forum, and private armies in the towers and 100 bodies a year in the river, run by a Spaniard everybody hated, and full of pilgrims. And in the middle of it, on the hill, in a newly painted palace, a girl with hair down to her knees was being taught Latin and dancing, and how to be charming, so that she could be sold to a man in another town. She was the only thing in that city worth anything, and she was the one thing in it that was for sale. So let us go up the hill and into that palace, and find her. Now let us find the girl, and the first fact of her childhood is that she was taken away from her mother, and nobody has ever quite explained why, and I think it is the most important fact in her life. Her mother was Vanozza dei Catane. She was Roman, and she was not noble, and almost everything about her origins is guesswork. What is certain is that she was Rodrigo Borgia's mistress for something like 10 years, that she bore him 4 children, that she was not a courtesan in the theatrical sense, but something much more like a wife, and that she was, by every scrap of evidence, a formidable businesswoman. That is the part I like. Vanozza owned inns, several of them, in Rome, and she ran them, and she made money, and she kept making money for 4 decades after the cardinal had moved on. She was married off 3 times to complacent husbands, which was the arrangement in that world. A churchman's mistress was given a husband for the look of the thing, and the husband was given a job. And when it was all over, When her son was dead and her daughter was in Ferrara and her lover was in his tomb, Vernozza went on running her inns and endowing her chapels and died in her bed at 76, respectable, rich, and buried with honours the Borgias themselves never got. She outlived nearly all of them. Hold that. And Lucrezia was taken out of her house at about 6 years old and given to somebody else. The somebody else was Adriana de Mila, who was Rodrigo's cousin, a Spanish widow of impeccable respectability with a palace near his own. And the child was moved there and raised there, and she saw her mother afterwards, occasionally at family dinners. And that is all we know. Why? Nobody says. The likeliest answer is the ugliest and the most ordinary. An innkeeper's house was not where you kept a girl who was going to be sold to a prince. She had to be finished properly in a noble household, with the right accent and the right manners and the right marriageability, and her mother could not supply that. So her mother was edited out. She was 6. She lost her mother to a career plan. Now the household she went into, because it is not what you think. Adriana de Mila's palace was a good, serious Spanish house, and the education there was excellent, and Lucrezia came out of it fluent in Italian, Spanish, French, and Latin, with some Greek, able to write verse, able to sing, and an extremely good dancer, which mattered more than you would imagine, and which she loved all her life. She had a proper humanist schooling. When she was Duchess of Ferrara, later she corresponded with the finest scholars in Italy, and they did not have to slow down for her. And she was also, for parts of her girlhood, put in a convent. That was normal. The convent of San Sisto took in girls of good family to be finished, and she was there for periods, and she went back to it later, at the 2 worst moments of her life, and she chose to be buried in one. There is a thread of the cloister running through this woman from beginning to end, and the version of her that has come down to us has no room for it at all. Now the other thing in that house, and this is where it gets complicated, Adriana de Mila had a daughter-in-law. Her name was Giulia Farnese, and she was 15, and she was celebrated as the most beautiful woman in Rome, and she was the Pope's mistress. And she lived in that house with Lucrezia. The 2 of them were within a year or 2 of each other in age. They shared a household, they shared a chaperone, they were painted together and gossiped about together, and Adriana de Mila, the respectable widow, was superintending both the education of the Pope's daughter and the availability of the Pope's mistress, who happened to be married to her own son. Let me put that plainly, because it is the whole texture of that world. A girl of 12 was being raised by her father's cousin in the same rooms as her father's teenage lover, who was her guardian's daughter-in-law. That was her normal. That's of the Zawata. Nobody under that roof thought it strange, and the girl grew up inside it, and I want you to hold that against every judgment anybody has ever made about her morals. She did not choose that. She was 6 when she was put in it, and the Romans called Giulia Farnese the Bride of Christ, which was their idea of a joke, and they laughed about the whole arrangement in the streets, and some of that laughter stuck to the child in the next room and never came off. So, what have we got by the time she is 12? A girl who has been taken from her mother, raised by a cousin, educated superbly, taught to dance and to write Latin and to be charming, kept in the same house as her father's mistress, and told from the beginning, in the way children are told things without being told them, that her purpose is to be given to somebody useful. And then, in the August of 1492, her father became the Pope, and everything about her value changed overnight, and the offers came in from every corner of Italy. But before the offers, I want to keep you in that household a little longer because of who else was living in it. There were 4 women under that roof, and between them they lay out every road that was open in that world, and Lucrezia was given the worst of the 4. Vernozza first, the mother, because she took the option that actually worked. She was a churchman's mistress, and then she was let go, and she took the money and the property and turned it into a business. Inns in Rome in a Jubilee century, which is the single best trade available in that city. She was married off 3 times to men who were paid to be her husband, and she outlived them and kept the property. She never went near the court after it was over. She had no title, no position, no claim on anybody, and she died at 76 in her own bed, in her own house, rich, respectable, an ornament of her parish, and she was buried with a funeral that had papal grooms in it, and her tomb inscription calls her the mother of Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia and Joffre, and lists them proudly in stone in a church in Rome, and it is still there. She got everything her daughter did not: her own money, her own house, her own name on her own tomb, and old age. And the price was that she was nobody. She was let go at 30, and she never mattered again to anybody with power, and she watched her children be spent from the outside, and could do nothing about a single one of it, and she buried 3 of them. Second, Adriana de Mila, who took the option of being useful. She was the cousin, the respectable widow, the safe pair of hands. She raised the Pope's daughter. She superintended the Pope's mistress. She ran a household that was in effect the domestic arm of the papacy, and she did it for 20 years, and she was trusted absolutely, and she was in every room, and what she actually was, when you take the courtesy away, is the woman who managed the availability of other women. That was the job. It was a good job. It gave her a palace and a position and the ear of the most powerful man in Christendom, and it required her to be the person who delivered a 15-year-old to a cardinal's bed and a 12-year-old to the marriage market, and she did both without a recorded flicker. Third, Giulia Farnese, who took the option of being beautiful. She was 15 when it started. She was married to Adriana's son, who was given money and an appointment and told to be somewhere else. She was La Bella Giulia, the loveliest creature in Italy by common agreement, and the wits of that city, who were merciless, had a nickname for her that I have already given you. And she was a brilliant operator, and this is the part that gets left out. Her brother was a nobody cardinal who owed his hat entirely to her, and everybody in Rome laughed at him and called him the petticoat cardinal. That man became Pope Paul III and reigned for 15 years and summoned the Council of Trent. Giulia Farnese's affair built a papacy. Her family, who had been small provincial gentry, became one of the great houses of Europe and stayed there for 300 years, and every bit of it comes out of a girl of 15 in a palace near the Vatican. And there is a story about her that is the best story in this evening. In 1494, the French army came through, and Giulia Farnese and Adriana were captured on the road by French soldiers, and the captain worked out who he had, and ransomed them back to the Pope for 3,000 ducats, and Alexander paid it instantly. And then he rode out to collect her personally, in black velvet, with a sword and a dagger on him, at 63 years old, dressed like a young man going to a duel. The Pope of Rome got dressed up to meet his mistress on the road. Everybody in Italy laughed about it for months. She got out in the end. She left before the fall, and she remarried, and she lived quietly, and she did fine. And fourth, Lucrezia, who took the only option nobody chooses, which is to be legitimate currency. Look at the 4 of them side by side, because this is the argument. Vanozza was a mistress, no status but her own money and her own life. Adriana was a servant, no status of her own, but power by proxy and total security. Giulia was a favourite, enormous influence, no rights whatever, and an exit when it stopped being fun. And Lucrezia was the daughter, the legitimate one in the sense that mattered, the acknowledged child, the one with the papal bull, the one whose name went in the contracts. She was the most valuable of the four by an enormous margin, and she was the only one who could be sold. That is the thing. The mistress could walk away. The chaperone could keep her job. The favourite could marry somebody else when it ended. The daughter could not do any of those things because the daughter was the asset itself, and an asset does not resign. The three women around her all had more freedom than she did, and every one of them had less status, and those two facts are the same fact. She was the pearl of that family, and a pearl does not get to decide who wears it. Before we go to the market where she was sold, I want to take you into one room in the Vatican, because her face is in it, and it was locked in the dark for 300 years. There is a room in the Vatican with her face in it, and it was sealed up for 300 years, and I want to take you into it, because it is the only place on earth where you can look at what her father thought she was. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope, he did not move into the papal apartments. He built his own 6 rooms on the floor below where the popes had always lived, and he had them decorated by Pinturicchio, who was one of the finest painters in Italy, and he told him to spare nothing. Gold leaf, real gold, laid on thick, and the new Spanish blue, and grotesques, and gilded stucco so heavy it stands out of the wall. It is the gaudiest suite in the Vatican. That is not an insult, it is what it is. The Italians thought it was vulgar and said so, and it was. And it was also magnificent, and it was very Spanish and very much a man announcing that he had arrived. And on the wall of the second chamber there is a fresco of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Saint Catherine, in the legend, was a girl of extraordinary learning who was hauled in front of the emperor and 50 of his philosophers to be argued out of her faith, and she out-argued all of them, and they killed her for it. So Pinturicchio painted the scene, the emperor on a throne, the philosophers arranged in front of him, and in the middle of them, standing alone, arguing, a young woman with heavy fair hair down her back in a gown of cloth of gold and crimson. Everybody who has ever stood in that room has said the same thing. It is her. It is not certain. Nothing is, but it was painted in about 1493 or 94, when Lucrezia Borgia was 13 or 14, and living a few hundred yards away, and the girl in the fresco is the right age, and has the right hair, and has a face that is not a generic saint's face but a particular person's. And the tradition that it is Lucrezia goes back a very long way. Now, think about what her father commissioned. He had his own private apartments painted with his daughter out-arguing an emperor. Not a Madonna, not a martyr weeping. Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the patron saint of scholars, the girl whose entire story is that she was cleverer than every man arranged against her, painted with his daughter's face and his daughter's hair, on the wall of the office where he received cardinals. That is what he thought she was, and that is why the Spoleto appointment is not surprising, and why he left her his correspondence. He had known since she was 13 exactly how good she was. And 4 years after that wall was painted, he had her brought down into a very similar chamber in the same building to be examined about her own body by a very similar row of men, and to lie about it in Latin because he had told her to. Once in paint, arguing and winning, once in the flesh, saying what she was given to say. Now, what became of that apartment, because this is the ending. When Alexander died in 1503, and Julius II came in a few months later, the new pope refused to live in it. He said, and this is documented, that he would not stay where that man had lived. He called the place by his name and would not sleep in it. So he moved upstairs and had Raphael paint him a new set of chambers, which is how the world got the Raphael stuns, and which is one of the great accidents in the history of art. The Borgia apartments were shut for 300 years, closed, used for storage, disregarded, damp, forgotten, with the gold going dull in the dark and St. Catherine arguing in an empty room in front of nobody for 3 centuries, because a pope hated a Spaniard. They were not open to the public until the 1890s. So for 300 years, while Victor Hugo was writing his play and Donizetti was writing his opera, and the whole of Europe was deciding that Lucrezia Borgia was a poisoner with a hollow ring, her actual face, the one her father commissioned, was locked in the dark in the Vatican with the shutters closed, arguing before an emperor and winning. You can go now. It is open. Most people walk through it on the way to the Sistine, in a queue, at speed, looking at their feet. She is up on the right. Gold hair, dark red gown, standing on her own in the middle of the men, with her hand up, making the point. And by the time that paint was dry, she had already been engaged twice, and both contracts had been made and torn up, and she was not yet 13. She was engaged twice before she was 13, to 2 men she never met. Both contracts were signed and sealed and then torn up when something better came along, and it happened inside about 15 months. The first was a Valencian nobleman. The contract was drawn in the February of 1491, when she was 10 years old. It was a proper legal instrument. Dowry, terms, the lot. She was 10, then at 2 months later, a better Spaniard turned up. So the first contract was cancelled, and a second one was made in the April to a different Valencian lord with a better name and better land, and that contract was signed too. 2 contracts in 2 months. She was 10 in the first and 11 in the second. And then, in the August of 1492, her father became Pope, and suddenly a provincial Spanish lord was an embarrassing thing for the Pope's daughter to be attached to. And the second contract was torn up as well, and the man was compensated, and Italy was told that the young lady's hand was available. 3 engagements by 12. None of the men had ever laid eyes on her. Now, I want to slow down here, because it is easy to hear that as picturesque, and it is not picturesque. It is the mechanism of her entire existence, and it is worth being exact about. What is happening is that her father is trading a live child on an open market. Each contract has a price and a strategic value, and when the value changes, he sells the position and buys a better one. The girl in the middle is an instrument. She has no say, she is not consulted, and crucially, she is not told. There is no letter anywhere in which anybody explains to Lucrezia Borgia what has been decided about the rest of her life. She learns it the way you learn the weather. And the thing I keep thinking about is what that does to a child's sense of the world. 3 times before she is 13, somebody tells her, "This is your husband." And 3 times the man simply disappears, replaced, because Papa found a better one. Nothing about her is fixed. Nothing about her is hers. A person is a piece on a board, and even the board keeps changing. And here is the specific cruelty. She adored him. That is the horrible thing. Every account we have of her as a girl says she was sunny, affectionate, and devoted to her father, and he was warm and funny, and gave her presents, and made a fuss of her. There was no coldness she could brace against. It was all love, and the love and the selling were the same activity, coming from the same man, in the same afternoon. I think that explains her. I think it explains the thing that is otherwise inexplicable about Lucrezia Borgia, which is her extraordinary, almost inhuman compliance. Never once in the whole record does she refuse. She does not run. She does not appeal to anybody. She goes where she is sent, 3 times, and on each arrival she is charming and she does the work, and the only rebellions in her entire life are so small you could miss them. She warned her first husband to run. She wept for her second. She signed 1 letter, once, in a way that has haunted me for years, and we will come to it. Because how would she refuse? Refuse whom? The person selling her was the person who loved her, and he was the Pope, and there was no appeal above him in the world or out of it. Now the market itself, and then we can meet the husband. The moment Rodrigo Borgia was elected, his daughter became one of the most valuable objects in Italy, and every power in the peninsula started bidding. There is a wonderful line from a cardinal of the time, and it is the whole business in one sentence. He wrote that there were many who longed to marry into the Pope's family through his daughter, and that the Pope let many of them think they had a chance, and that even the King of Naples had hopes of her. Let many of them believe they had a chance. That is the auction itself in a letter from a man who was in the room. And what he actually needed was Milan. Rome in 1492 was a small state surrounded by larger ones. Naples to the south, Milan to the north, Venice, Florence, France over the mountains and getting interested. The papacy had spiritual authority and almost no divisions, and a new pope who was a foreigner with no Italian family behind him needed a great house on his side quickly, and the greatest house going was the Sforza of Milan. So the deal was made with a Sforza, not the Duke, who was married, a cousin from a minor branch, lord of a small town on the Adriatic coast called Pesaro. His name was Giovanni Sforza. He was a widower of about 26. He was a professional soldier of no particular distinction, in debt, holding a scrap of territory, and his entire value was that his surname opened a door to Milan. And the price of the door was a girl of 13. She was married on the 12th of June, 1493, in the Vatican, at 13 years and 2 months old. The wedding was talked about in Italy for the rest of her life, and the groom did not want to be there. Let me give you the day, because it is one of the great set pieces of the Renaissance, and it tells you everything about what that family was. She came in with 150 women behind her. That is the number in the accounts. 150 ladies walking through the papal apartments, and at the head of them a girl of 13 in a gown so heavy with gold thread and pearls that she needed help to move in it, with her hair loose down her back, which was what an unmarried girl wore, and her hair was famous, heavy and gold, and long past her knees, and she was proud of it her whole life, and washed it herself. And there are inventories listing her hair-washing days because the court had to be arranged around them. There was a black page carrying her train. There was a cardinal on either side. The Pope sat on a throne, on a dais, in his own palace, and watched his daughter married in front of 10 cardinals, and the ambassadors of every power in Italy, and made no pretense whatsoever that she was anything other than his child. The party afterwards went on into the night, and there was a comedy performed, and there were sweetmeats thrown down the fronts of the ladies' dresses by the men, which was apparently hilarious, and which the Pope's master of ceremonies recorded with his lips pursed so tight you can hear them from here. And that is where the Borgia legend starts. Not with poison, with a wedding that was too loud, too Spanish, too fond, and too obviously a father showing off his daughter in the palace of the church, in front of everybody. Now the groom, Giovanni Sforza, was about 26. He was a soldier, competent, unremarkable. He had been married before, and his first wife had died in childbirth. He was lord of Pesaro, a pleasant small town on the Adriatic that he could not really afford, and he was chronically short of money, and he had been sent to Rome to collect a child bride and a dowry of 30,000 ducats. And here is what strikes me about him, and it is why I am not going to make him a villain, quite. He was frightened from the first day. He knew what he was. He knew he was there because of a surname. And he knew, as all Italy did, that the Borgias used people and discarded them. He was walking into the most dangerous family in Europe as their least valuable asset. And he was marrying a girl half his age, whose father would not let her go, and whose brother watched him across the table. He was also, by the terms imposed on him, not allowed to take her away. That is a detail I love. The marriage was consummated later, when she was 14, but the Pope kept her in Rome, in her own palace near his, and Sforza had to live there too, in his father-in-law's city, on his father-in-law's money, as an ornament in his father-in-law's household, for the best part of a year, because Rodrigo Borgia could not bear to have his daughter more than a few streets away. Try to imagine what that did to a man of 26 with an accent to be laughed at and no money. Eventually they went to Pesaro, and I want to give you those years, because they are the only stretch of her early life that was anything like ordinary, and nobody ever tells them. Pesaro is a small town on the sea, with a castle and a harbour and hills behind it. She was 14 and 15 and 16 there, on and off. She had a household of her own for the first time. She kept it well. The accounts survive, and they are the accounts of somebody paying attention. She was popular in the town, which is a pattern that will repeat everywhere she ever went. She wrote letters to Rome, and the letters are the ordinary letters of a young woman. She is well, she thanks him, she misses him, she is sending a present. There is no evidence at all of anything wrong in that marriage on her side. None. There is no scandal, no lover, no complaint, and the only reports of unhappiness are of the very ordinary kind, which is a young woman in a small provincial town who has been raised in Rome and finds it slow. When the plague came through in the summer of 1494, the two of them left together and went inland, and there is a letter she wrote to her father from that flight, and she is worried about her husband's health. So there it is, a political marriage made when she was 13 to a man she had not chosen, in which she seems to have done exactly what she was raised to do, and to have been, if not happy, then not obviously unhappy either. And then the map changed. The French came over the Alps in 1494, and the whole peninsula turned upside down, and Milan and Rome ended up on opposite sides. And suddenly the Sforza connection was not an asset. It was a liability sitting in the family's own house. And the Borgias began to consider what to do about a husband who had stopped being useful. The destruction of that first marriage took 2 years, and it is the ugliest divorce in European history. And the girl at the centre of it was 17, and what they did to her in that room is why the rest of this evening happens. Start with the escape, because she saved his life. By the spring of 1497 the situation was plain. Rome had gone one way, and Milan had gone the other. Giovanni Sforza was living in his father-in-law's city, surrounded by his father-in-law's Spaniards, watching his usefulness drain away. And he was terrified, and he had cause. He wrote to his uncle in Milan that he was in fear of his life. And one day he got on a horse and rode for Pesaro, and did not stop until he got there. 24 hours, and the horse died under him at the gate. And every account we have says the same thing about why he went, and it is this. Lucrezia warned him. She told him to run. Her father and her brother had decided something, and she found out, and she told her husband, and he went. That is her one recorded act of disobedience in the whole first half of her life, and it saved a man she had no particular reason to love. Hold that against everything you have ever been told about her. Now, the machinery. The Borgias wanted the marriage gone, and there were only 2 ways to get rid of a husband: kill him or annul it. He had taken himself out of range, so they set about the annulment. And here is where you see what canon law actually was, which was a weapon with a handle for whoever had the Pope. The ground they settled on was non-consummation. The marriage, they said, had never been consummated at all, in 4 years, and therefore there had been no marriage at all, and the dowry notably would come back. Sforza's answer to that has survived, and it is one of the great furious documents of the age. He said that he had known her innumerable times. He said, And this is the part that hurts, that the Pope had taken her away from him for his own purposes, and he offered to prove his potency, in his rage, to do it in front of witnesses, publicly, with her present, or with a woman of the Borgia's choosing, in front of the papal legate. He actually offered that. They ignored it. Of course they did. The point was never truth. His own family told him to sign. That is the thing that finished him. Milan looked at the arithmetic and decided that a war with the papacy over one cousin's dignity was not worth it, and Ludovico Sforza told him to take the deal, and his uncle the cardinal agreed with him, and when he still refused, they simply withdrew, and he was alone in a small town with the Pope's lawyers at the door. He signed in the November. He put his name to a document stating that he was incapable, that he had never been able to perform, and that the marriage was therefore void. He was allowed to keep the dowry, which is the price of a man's public manhood, 30,000 ducats. And then, on the 22nd of December, 1497, Lucrezia Borgia was brought in front of a commission of cardinals to give her testimony. She was 17. She stood before a room of men in the Vatican and swore that she was a virgin, that her marriage of 4 years had never been consummated, that no man had ever touched her, and the cardinals thanked her, and the record notes that she spoke in elegant Latin, and it says something about her composure, and one of them wrote afterwards that she was the most delightful young woman. She was, on the best evidence available, about 6 months pregnant at the time. I am going to be careful here, because this is where the legend feeds. The pregnancy is not certain. It rests on hostile reports, on the fact that she was in a convent for months, and on the appearance, the following year, of a child. But it is believed by most people who have looked at it properly, and the timing works, and there is a body in the Tiber that we will come to. But leave the paternity out of it for one moment, because it is a distraction, and look at what actually happened in that room. A girl of 17 was made to stand up in front of the most powerful men in Christendom and testify, under oath, about the inside of her own body, about whether her husband had ever once had her in the 4 years she lived with him. She had to say it out loud, in Latin, elegantly, and be praised for her delivery. And every word of it was arranged by her father, who was sitting at the top of that building, and every word of it was a lie that he had written for her. And if she was carrying a child while she said it, then she had to stand there in a loose gown and say it anyway. That is the annulment of Lucrezia Borgia. It was not a legal proceeding. It was a public examination of a teenage girl's body, conducted by her father for a change in foreign policy, and her husband, humiliated, ruined, publicly declared impotent by his own signature, went away and did the only thing he had left, which was to talk. He said the Pope wanted her for himself. That sentence has followed her for 500 years. It has been in the books and the operas and the films. It was said by a frightened man in the worst month of his life, with no evidence in revenge, and it worked, because it was the one thing he could throw that would stick. He never repeated it under oath. He never produced anything. He went home to Pesaro, married again a few years later, had a son, and lived quietly, and by all accounts spent the rest of his life a bitter man in a small town. And she went into the convent of San Sisto and stayed there for months and would not come out. And Rome talked, and a young man who worked for her father was pulled out of the river with his hands tied. In the February of 1498, a young Spaniard called Pedro Calderon was pulled out of the Tiber, and a woman of the household was found in the water with him. And nobody has ever proved anything, and this is the darkest hour in this evening. Here is what we have, and I will give you only what is actually in the record. Calderon was a chamberlain of the Pope's, a Spaniard, young, and he is called Perotto in most of the accounts, which is the diminutive, the way you would call a boy by his nickname. He carried letters. He went between the Vatican and the convent of San Sisto, where Lucrezia was living through the annulment. In the February of 1498, he was arrested. The papal master of ceremonies wrote in his diary that Perotto had fallen into the Tiber, not of his own will, and that his body was fished out below the bridge. Days later, a woman of the household called Pantasilea was found in the river too. There is one further account from a Venetian which says that Cesare Borgia pursued him under the Pope's own cloak and that the blood spurted up into the Pope's face. That is one hostile diarist retailing a story, and it is almost certainly theatre, and it is quoted in every book. That is everything. That is the entire evidence. And then, about a year later, there is a child. He is called Giovanni Borgia, and history calls him the Infans Romanus, the child of Rome, and he was born somewhere around 1498, and nobody knows where or to whom, and in 1501 2 papal bulls were issued about him on the same day. The first says he is Cesare's son, by an unmarried woman, born before Cesare's marriage. The second, which was kept secret, makes him a son of Alexander himself. 2 contradictory documents from the same office, on the same day, about the same 3-year-old. Lucrezia's name is not in either of them. Now, what do we make of it? The legend goes she had a baby by Perotto while she was in the convent swearing she was a virgin, and her brother killed him for it, and the child was hidden with the bulls. And I want to say that this is possible. I am not going to pretend otherwise. The timing fits. The convent fits. The Venetian gossip of the time says exactly that. There were people in Rome who believed it at the time. But look at the alternatives, because they fit at least as well. The first is that the child was Rodrigo's by some woman, and the second bull is simply true. And the whole family closed ranks and shuffled the paperwork because a pope's newborn son in 1498 was an embarrassment even by their standards. The second is that the child was Cesare's, which the first bull says, and which the family let stand publicly for years, and which is why the boy was given a duchy in 1502, and dukedoms went to sons. And the third is that Calderon was killed for carrying letters. Think about what those letters were. She was in a convent, in the middle of the most delicate annulment in Europe, and a young man was going in and out of it with correspondence. If he was carrying anything the family did not want carried, or if he had simply seen too much of a girl who was about to swear to a room of cardinals that she was untouched, that is motive enough, in that family, in that month. And here is the thing I keep coming back to, the fact that the legend cannot metabolize. In 1503, after the Pope died and the family fell, that boy went to Ferrara, and Lucrezia took him in and raised him in her household, alongside her own children, and he was received there, and lived there, and was known there as her half-brother. That is the arrangement she chose, in a court that watched her every move, at a moment when she had no power at all, and could not have imposed a lie on anybody. If he had been her son, she had to look at him every day at the table with his identity, a fiction that half of Italy had already guessed. If he was her half-brother, she was doing what she did with every stray of that shattered family, which was to gather them up. She gathered them all up. That is what she did after the fall. Her brother's daughter, this boy, various Borgia relations left with nothing when the fortune collapsed. They all went to Ferrara, and she housed them, and found them husbands, and paid for them out of her own accounts, and the accounts survive. So I am going to leave that child exactly where the evidence leaves him, which is unresolved. I do not know, neither does anybody else, and I would rather say that to you plainly than sell you a certainty, because certainty is what has been sold about this woman for 500 years, and it has been a lie each time, in both directions. So take the shape of it instead. Whatever the truth of the child, here is one girl of 17 and about 14 months. Her husband ran for his life because she told him to. Her family put her in a convent. They took her marriage apart in public and made her testify about her own body in Latin to a room of cardinals. A young man who came and went with her letters was pulled out of the Tiber with a woman of her household. Rome laughed about her in the streets. And somewhere in the middle of all that, on the best evidence we have, she may have had a child and lost it into the machinery of her father's household and never been allowed to say so. And in the July of 1498, 6 months after she had stood up in front of those cardinals and sworn she was untouched, her father married her to somebody else. He was 17 years old. His name was Alfonso. And this one, at last, she actually loved. Alfonso of Aragon was 17 when she married him, and 19 when they killed him. And he is the reason this is a tragedy, and not just a scandal. Wow. He was the illegitimate son of the King of Naples, which sounds grand, and was, and also meant that he was exactly what she was, a beautiful young person of no standing except a surname, produced for the purpose of being spent. He was Duke of Biscay. He was, by every single account, lovely to look at. The dispatches used the word repeatedly. The ambassadors who wrote home about him could not stop mentioning it. He was 17. He had good manners. He was cheerful, and he arrived in Rome in the summer of 1498 to marry a girl of 18 who had just come out of a convent after the worst year of her life. And they fell in love. This is not romantic invention. It is what the reports say, and they say it with a certain surprise, because nobody had planned for it. The ambassadors write that the Duke and Duchess are inseparable. They write that she is happier than anyone has seen her. There is a description of the two of them together that reads like two children who cannot believe their luck. Two teenagers in the middle of the most poisonous court in Europe. Both of them sold there by their fathers, who found each other. They were married in the July. There is a nice detail from the ceremony. A scuffle broke out during it, and a man's clothes were slashed, because the Borgia weddings always ended in something, and they were given palaces, and they lived in Rome, and in the November of 1499 she had a son, and called him Rodrigo, after her father. She was 19. Hold on to that boy. He is going to matter more than anything else in this evening. Now, the trouble, and it came almost at once. The whole marriage was an alliance with Naples. That was its function. Naples was Spanish, and it was the counterweight to France. And while the Borgias wanted a Spanish policy, Alfonso was useful. And Cesare went to France. That is the pivot of the entire Borgia story, and it happens in 1498. Cesare Borgia gave up his cardinal's hat, which no one had ever done, and went to the French court, and was made Duke of Valentinois by the King of France, and was given a French wife and French troops, and came back over the Alps in 1499 with an army to carve himself a state out of the Romagna. And from that moment, Naples was on the wrong side of the table, and Lucrezia's marriage was not an asset. It was a piece of Naples living inside the family's own house. Alfonso worked it out before anybody told him. In the August of 1499 he got on a horse and left Rome, exactly as Giovanni Sforza had done, and for exactly the same reason. He wrote to her to follow him, and here is where it becomes unbearable. She did the honourable thing, and it killed him. Her father sent her out of Rome to Spoleto to keep her out of the way, and Alfonso, in the October, came back. He came back for her. He rode to Spoleto and joined her there, and they went back to Rome together, and she was pregnant. And I think they both believed that if they behaved properly, if they were loyal and useful and gave the Pope a grandson, they would be allowed to live. They were 19 and 18. Of course they believed it. And for a few months it looked as though they were right. The baby came in the November of 1499 and was christened with the whole of Rome. Watching and the Pope delighted. Rodrigo Borgia was besotted with that grandchild. There are reports of the Pope of Rome carrying the baby about. And also Cesare was in the north taking cities, and the French alliance was hardening, and Naples was going to have to go. Now, why did Alfonso have to die? Why not another annulment? Because you cannot annul this one. There was a child, and the child was healthy, and everybody in Rome had seen the wedding and the christening, and the two of them holding hands at supper. Impotence was not available. Non-consummation was not available. There was a boy in a cradle, so there was one door left, and Cesare Borgia was not a man who agonized over doors. I want to give you Cesare properly for one moment, because he is standing in the corner of every scene from here on. He was the eldest surviving son. He was 2 years older than Lucrezia. He was brilliant. He was beautiful. And he was, in the modern sense of a word we should use carefully, without conscience. Machiavelli followed him around for months and wrote a book with him at the centre of it, and could not stop admiring him. He was a genuinely gifted soldier and administrator, and when his brother Juan was found in the Tiber with 9 wounds in him in 1497, half of Rome said Cesare had done it, and nothing was ever proved, and Cesare inherited everything Juan had. That is the man who decided that his sister's husband was in the way. But before we go up those steps, you need the rest of that family, because there were 4 Borgia children, and I have only given you 2 of them, and one of the others was already in the river. I have to give you the brothers now, all of them, because there were 4 Borgia children, and 2 of them died violently, and one of them almost certainly killed the other. The survivor is the man standing behind every door in this story. Juan first, because he is the one who was loved best, and it destroyed him. He was the second son, and he was his father's favourite, openly, embarrassingly, and everybody could see it. The plan was old, and it was Spanish. The eldest goes to the church, the second gets the sword. So Cesare, who was clever and hard and wanted armies, was put into the church at 17 and made a cardinal at 18. And Juan, who was by all accounts an idle, arrogant, unserious young man of no particular ability, was given the duchy, the Spanish marriage, the troops, and the command of the papal armies. Cesare had to watch that for years. He was the better man at everything, and he was in a red hat, and his brother, who was worse at all of it, had the army and the title and their father's arm round him. Juan was a disaster as a commander. He was given a war against the Orsini, and he lost it, and he was wounded, and he came home and was forgiven and promoted, because he was the favourite, and nothing he did could touch that. And on the 14th of June, 1497, he had supper with his mother and his brother at Vanozza's vineyard, and afterwards he rode off into the city with a masked man on his horse behind him, saying he had business, and he was never seen alive again. They found him in the Tiber, with 9 wounds in him and his throat cut, and his purse still on him with 30 ducats in it, which told everybody at once that it was not a robbery. The Pope went mad with grief. That is not a figure of speech. He shut himself in a room for 3 days, and would not eat, and would not see anybody. And when he came out, he stood in a consistory and said that the papacy meant nothing to him now, that he would have given 7 papacies to have his son back, and he announced a reform of the church. The reform lasted about a fortnight. That is Rodrigo Borgia in 1 sentence. And the investigation, which was enormous and thorough, was called off. Suddenly, completely without explanation, within weeks. The Pope simply stopped it and said that the matter was in God's hands, and nobody ever asked again. Everybody in Rome knew what that meant. If you halt the hunt for your son's murderer, it is because you have found out who did it, and you cannot afford the answer. Cesare got everything. Within a year he was out of the church, the first cardinal in history to resign the hat, and he had the armies, the French duchy, the wife, and the plan. Nobody ever proved it. There were other suspects. The Orsini, who had reason, a jealous husband or two, the whole city, frankly, but nobody in Italy believed anybody except Cesare, and I do not either, and I want to say why it matters to this evening. Because 3 years later he had Alfonso strangled in a bed. Because in 1502 he lured 4 of his own captains to a town called Senigallia by promising them a reconciliation, and had them taken and executed in a room. And Machiavelli was there and watched it, and wrote a report about it that reads like a man watching a master craftsman work. Because he took Urbino by pretending to be an ally and asking for a loan of the artillery. That is the pattern. He was not a hot-blooded man. He was patient and charming, and he waited, and then he did the thing exactly. And it was always somebody who had been told they were safe. And the 4th child, Joffre, the youngest, is the footnote, and he is the proof of the whole system. He was married at 13 to Sansia of Aragon, who was 16 or 17, a Neapolitan king's daughter, spirited and beautiful, and thoroughly capable of running the situation. And the marriage was a joke in Rome from the first month, because Sanchia was reportedly involved with both of his brothers, and everybody knew, and Joffre was a boy of 13 who could do nothing about it, and the family barely troubled to hide it. He is the only one of the 4 who was of no use, and so he is the only one nothing was ever done to. He lived. He outlived every one of them, and inherited a small principality through his wife's family, and died in the 1550s as a minor Italian lord that nobody had ever heard of, which is the happiest ending in this family by a very long way. And Sanchia was the one who nursed Alfonso in that room beside Lucrezia. That is worth knowing. When the men came, there were 2 women in the doorway, and the other one was Alfonso's sister, so 4 children, 1 in a river with 9 wounds, 1 strangled in a ditch in Navarre at 31, 1 sold 3 times and dead at 39 after a birth. The useless one, who lived, being valuable to Rodrigo Borgia, was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a person, and every one of his children learned it, except the one he never wanted anything from. Now, there is one more thing before the steps, and it is the part of her life that nobody tells. In the August of 1499, Pope Alexander VI appointed his daughter governor of Spoleto and Foligno, and once you know that, everything you have been told about her looks different. She was 19. Now, I want to be precise about what that was, because it gets waved away as a courtesy title, and it was not one. Spoleto was a papal city with a fortress, a duchy in the old sense, one of the most important holdings in the papal states. Its governor was normally a cardinal, or a senior churchman, or a soldier. It was a real job. You administered justice, you kept the peace between factions, you managed the garrison, you dealt with the surrounding lords, and you answered to Rome, and he gave it to a girl of 19. He sent her there with a brief, and the brief survives, and it is not decorative. She was ordered to govern. The city was appalled. Of course it was. There is no precedent anywhere for a young woman being sent to run a fortress town, and the priors of Spoleto received a papal letter telling them in effect to do what she said. And she did it. That is the astonishing thing. For about 3 months, Lucrezia Borgia governed a papal city in her own person at 19, and the records of it survive, and they are dull. which is the highest compliment you can pay to an administration. She heard cases. She dealt with the dispute between Spoleto and a neighbouring town that had been running for years and had involved men being killed, and she settled it. She corresponded with Rome about the citadel. She managed the garrison's pay. She was good at it, and that is not the only time. When her father went out of Rome, on 2 occasions, he left her in his own apartments with authority to open his correspondence and deal with what could be dealt with a cardinal at her elbow to advise on anything requiring the sacrament. That is as close as any woman has ever come to running the papacy, and it caused a considerable scandal, and he did it anyway, twice, because she was capable, and he knew it, and there was nobody he trusted more. Now sit with the contradiction, because it is the whole of her. The same man who thought his daughter competent to govern a fortress city at 19 and to open the correspondence of the Holy See, also thought she was a piece of property to be sold to whichever house was useful that season. Both of those were true at once, in the same head, and he saw no tension in them whatsoever. That, I think, is the most useful thing I can tell you about that century and about her. It was not that they thought women were stupid. Rodrigo Borgia plainly did not. He had watched her run a household at 14 and a city at 19, and he used her abilities without hesitation. It is that a woman's competence and a woman's ownership were separate questions. She could be trusted with a duchy, and could not be trusted with the disposal of her own body. And there was no inconsistency, because the body belonged to the family, and the ability was simply a useful feature of the asset. She could govern a city for him. She could not decline to marry. And here is the detail from Spoleto that finishes me. While she was there, governing, doing the accounts, hearing the cases, her young husband, who had fled Rome in fear of his life, came to her. He rode to Spoleto in the October and joined her, and for a few weeks the two of them were in that citadel together, 19 and 18, with a baby on the way, a long way from her family, in a fortress she was running herself. That is the closest thing to a home she ever had in the first half of her life. A few weeks in a hill town in Umbria in the autumn with the man she loved, in a place where she was in charge. And then the Pope sent for them, and they went back to Rome, because when the Pope sends for you, you go. 9 months later Alfonso was dead, and she was made governor of Nepi afterwards, and she governed that too, and later Ferrara, again and again, whenever her third husband rode out to the wars. This woman ran cities for 20 years. It is in the accounts. It is in the correspondence. It is uncontested. And the thing history remembers is a ring that never existed. On the night of the 15th of July, 1500, Alfonso of Aragon was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's. And what happened over the next month is the worst thing in this evening, and the best evidence of what she was. He had been at supper with the Pope. He came out late, in the dark, with 2 companions, and crossed towards the steps, and there were men lying there among the beggars who slept on them, and they came up out of the dark with knives. They cut him badly. Head, arm, shoulder, thigh. His companions were wounded. He got away because his people fought back, and because he was young and strong, and he was carried back into the Vatican bleeding all over the floor of the very building he had just left. And the assassins ran to horses that were waiting for them at the edge of the square, and rode out of a gate that had been left open, and were never caught, because nobody looked. Everybody in Rome knew within the hour. The Venetian ambassador wrote it down. Nobody knows who wounded the Duke, but it is said to be the same man who murdered his brother, meaning Cesare. That is a diplomat writing home in the same week, naming the Pope's son as the killer of the Pope's other son, and now the Pope's son-in-law, and treating it as common knowledge. Now, what she did. They carried him up to a room in the Borgia apartments, and Lucrezia Borgia and her sister-in-law, Alfonso's sister Sanzia, took him and did not leave him. They nursed him themselves. For a month. She was 20, and she had a baby of 8 months, and she moved into that room and stayed in it. She had 16 guards put on the door. She had the windows watched. And she cooked his food. That is the detail. That is the one I want you to carry out of this evening. Lucrezia Borgia, the great poisoner of legend, the woman with the ring, spent the summer of 1500 preparing her husband's meals with her own hands in the corner of his sick room over a little fire, because she would not let anything into that room that had come from her family's kitchens. She had no illusions. She knew who had done it, and that they would come back, and she did the only thing available to somebody with no authority at all, which was to stand in the doorway and cook. The Pope came to see him. The Pope, who loved her, and who was almost certainly party to the whole business, came and sat with the wounded boy and was gracious. And there is a report that Cesare came too, and stood at the foot of the bed, and said, so that people heard him, that what was not finished at breakfast would be finished at dinner. He recovered. That is the thing. Against everything, over a month, with his wife feeding him spoonful by spoonful, Alfonso of Aragon got better. He was up. He was walking. The wounds had closed. On the 18th of August he was well enough to be sitting up and talking with people in the room. And that afternoon a man came in with soldiers and told the women that the Duke was under arrest, and that they must go and speak to the Pope about it. They understood at once, and Lucrezia protested and was taken out anyway, and she and Sanzia were marched off to find the Pope and were kept from getting back, and it took about 10 minutes. Micheletto Carella was Caesar's man, his executioner, the one he used, and he had come in with the soldiers, and when the room was empty of women, he strangled a 19-year-old boy in his bed with his own hands. The official announcement was that the Duke had fallen out of bed and reopened his wounds and bled to death. Nobody was expected to believe. That was the point. The whole business was an announcement. They buried him that night quickly in the church he had been cut down in front of, with almost nobody there. Now, what happened to her? She screamed. That is in the record. She wept and she screamed and she would not stop, and she went on for days, and the Vatican found it embarrassing. There is a phrase in one report about her excessive weeping, and another about how the Pope was becoming annoyed with her grief, and I have never got that out of my head. A girl of 20 had her husband strangled in the next room by her brother's servant, and her family found her sorrow tiresome, and after a few weeks of it they sent her away. They gave her Nepi, a fortress town in the hills 60 miles north, and told her to go and be governor of it, and she went in the autumn with her baby and her women, and she stayed there for months. And in that castle at Nepi she wrote letters, and she signed some of them in a way that she never used before and never used again. She signed herself the unhappiest of women. That is all. 2 words in Italian at the bottom of a letter about administration. La Infelicissima. It is the only thing in the entire archive that is her own account of her own feelings, unmediated, in her own hand, and it is a signature. She was 20 years old. She had been married twice. One husband had run for his life on her warning and destroyed her name in revenge. The other had been strangled in his bed by her family while she was hammering on a door somewhere else in the building. And she had 8 months to be sad in, because by the spring they had found her somebody else. The negotiation for her 3rd marriage is the most humiliating document in this whole story, and she was not in the room for any of it, and it went on for a year. The Borgias wanted Ferrara. Understand why? Because it is the last piece of the plan. Cesare was carving a state out of the Romagna, town by town, with French troops. and Ferrara sat directly on top of it. An old duchy, rich, ancient, a real power with an ancient name, ruled by the Este family, who had been there for 300 years and who were the most respectable people in Italy. If Ferrara was tied in, Cesari's new state had a northern anchor and legitimacy. If Ferrara was hostile, the whole thing was a house of cards with an enemy at the top of the stairs. So the Pope decided that his daughter would marry Alfonso d'Este, the heir, and Ferrara said no, Duke Ercole d'Este did not want her. He said so, in writing, at length, for months. His objections are perfectly plain in the correspondence, and they are worth hearing because they are what Europe thought of her. She was illegitimate. She was Spanish. She was the daughter of a pope, which was worse than being the daughter of nobody. She had been married twice already, one husband alive, and publicly declaring her family had ruined him, the other freshly murdered by her brother. She was 21, and she came with a reputation that had been in every court in Italy for 4 years. And his son was the heir to a house older than most kingdoms, he said, and this is close to the actual language, that his family did not marry that sort of woman. And Alfonso d'Este himself did not want her either. That is documented, and it is important for later. He was 24, a widower already, a serious, blunt, physical man who liked artillery and hated ceremony, and he was appalled at the idea. He held out. There is a report of him saying he would rather not. So how did it happen? 2 things. The first is that the Pope leaned on them, and a Pope leaning on a Duke of the Papal States in 1501 was not a metaphor. Ferrara held its lands as a papal fief. There were legates. There were hints about the tribute, about privileges, about what might happen to a duchy with no friends when Cesare Borgia's army was 40 miles away and had just taken everything else. It was, stripped of the courtesies, a threat. And the second is that Ercole d'Este, who had spent a year saying his family did not marry that sort of woman, sat down and haggled. This is the part I want you to hear properly. He got the dowry up to 100,000 ducats, which was an enormous sum, one of the largest in the century. He got the papal tribute on Ferrara, reduced almost to nothing, in perpetuity. He got benefices, castles, and offices for his relations. He got the terms written down. He priced her. He spent a year explaining to Europe that this woman was beneath his house, and then he charged for taking her by the item. And when the number was high enough, his objections evaporated. Read those letters and you understand this century better than any book will teach you. It was never about her morals. It was about the price. Her reputation was a negotiating position, and it was worth, in the end, 100,000 ducats and a tax cut. And there is one more detail, and it is the worst. Ercole sent people to look at her. Envoys came down to Rome and were received, and their job was to report back on the goods. And they did. They wrote home about her figure, her hair, her teeth, her manner, her carriage, how she danced, how she spoke, whether she seemed healthy, whether she seemed likely to bear children. One of them wrote a description of her as a woman of great grace, who dances tirelessly and carries herself beautifully, and it reads exactly like a man valuing a mare, because that is what it was. She was made to perform for them. She sang. She danced, in a gown, in front of the emissaries who had been sent to decide whether her body was worth the money her father was paying to get rid of her. She was 21, and she had buried a husband a year earlier who had been strangled a corridor away from her, and she got up and danced in front of the men from Ferrara because that was the job. The contract was signed in the August of 1501. She was married by proxy in the Vatican on the 30th of December, with a stand-in wearing the groom's clothes, because Alfonso d'Este would not come to Rome to fetch her. He sent his brothers instead. She had never seen him. She had never seen a picture of him that anybody trusted. She knew he had spent a year trying not to marry her, and on the 6th of January 1502 she left Rome forever with a train of over 1,000 people in the middle of winter to cross the Apennines to a city that did not want her. Her father stood and watched her go, and then went and moved from window to window in the palace to keep her in sight as long as he could, and there is a report of it, and he never saw her again. The journey from Rome to Ferrara took 27 days in the worst of the winter, and it is the strangest procession of that century, and I want to walk it with you because it is the exact moment her life turns over. The train was more than 1,000 people. Read that again. 1,000. Her household, her women, her Spaniards, the Este brothers who had come to fetch her, mules, wagons, bishops, musicians, 150 guests of quality with their own servants. It moved at the speed of the slowest cart through the Apennines. In January, in snow, she was carrying on her person and in the boxes jewels valued at a fortune. Her father had emptied the treasury into her. He gave her the pearls, and there is a story about one particular string of them that she kept all her life. The whole point of the display was to tell Ferrara that the Pope's daughter was not a beggar, and she had a system. And this is the detail that tells you she was cleverer than everybody around her. She rested. She stopped the whole procession, repeatedly, for a day or two at a time, in the towns along the road, and the Este men were furious about it and wrote home complaining that she was slow, that she was delaying, that she took an entire day to wash her hair. She did take a day to wash her hair. It went past her knees. It was her one great beauty, and she knew it, and washing it was a whole operation, and then it had to dry. But that is not why she was stopping. She was making them arrive slowly in the middle of winter, town after town, so that all of Italy could see what was coming. 1,000 people, the pearls, the Pope's daughter, unhurried, entirely at her ease, in no rush whatever to reach a family that had spent a year insulting her. She was managing her own entrance. At 21, on a road in the snow with nobody advising her, she understood that the way she arrived would decide the next 20 years, and so she took her time and let the story build ahead of her. And she stopped at Bologna, and she stopped at Imola, and at every stop she was charming, and they liked her. And by the time she got near Ferrara, the reports going ahead of her were not about a Borgia. They were about a beautiful, gracious young duchess with excellent manners and remarkable hair. Now, the arrival. They came in on the 2nd of February, 1502. The city had put on everything it had, arches, allegories, cannon, the whole apparatus, and the streets were full, and the people had come out in their thousands, and they had not come out to welcome her. They had come to look at her. That is the thing to hold. Everybody on that route had heard the stories, the whore of Rome, the Pope's daughter who slept with her father, the poisoner. They were standing in the cold on the 2nd of February to get a look at a monster. And what came past them was a girl of 21 on a mule under a canopy, in a gown of gold, with her hair loose, smiling at them. And Ferrara fell in love with her, more or less on the spot, and never really stopped. And 17 years later, when she died, they closed the shops. I do not want to make it sound easy, because it was not. The first 2 years there were awful, and we are coming to them. But the arrival worked, and it worked because she was superb at exactly this, at being looked at and giving people something better to look at than the story they had brought with them. Now the two she had to deal with, and they are the reason those first years were hell. The father-in-law, Ercole, who had priced her by the item, and who was 70 and mean and pious, and did not want her in his house. He set about the household immediately. Within weeks he was sending her Spaniards home, cutting her allowance, taking her women away, arguing with her about money. He wanted her isolated, dependent, and quiet. There was a long, grinding, wretched fight about her income that ran on, in which a woman of 21 with 100,000 ducats of dowry in the family's treasury had to beg her father-in-law for the money to pay her own servants. Her and the sister-in-law, who had travelled from Mantua for the wedding specifically to inspect her, and who took against her in the first hour, and the husband, who had been dragged to the altar and had said so publicly. That is what she walked into on the 2nd of February. A father-in-law who resented paying for her, a sister-in-law who was writing letters about her to everyone she knew, and a husband who had not wanted her. She was there for 17 years. She buried the father-in-law, she outlasted the sister-in-law, and as for the husband, you will hear what he wrote at the end of it. Nobody has ever given her the credit for that, and it is the most impressive thing anybody in this evening does. But first they threw her a party, and it is the best documented week of the Italian Renaissance. The wedding festivities at Ferrara went on for a week, and they are the best documented party of the Italian Renaissance, and I want to walk you through them, because it is the last time in her life that anybody threw anything for her. Start with the entry itself, on the 2nd of February. She came in on a mule under a canopy, and the canopy was carried by doctors of the university, which is a nice detail, the learned men of the city on foot, holding a cloth over the Pope's daughter. She had changed her clothes for it, out of the travelling things, into a gown of gold and purple with slashed sleeves, and her hair was loose and down her back, and there was a net of gold and diamonds over it, and a little cap. There was a triumphal arch. There were the guilds. There were the Jews of Ferrara, who came out with a formal address, because Ercole d'Este had let them in, when other cities were throwing them out. And Ferrara had a Jewish community which was one of the few in Italy that could breathe. And there were cannon, because Alfonso liked cannon, and he had made them himself, and the whole city shook, and they fired so much powder that the smoke hung in the streets. Her mule bolted. That is the best thing in the entire account. Something startled it, and it went, and there was a scramble, and she got down off it, and got up on a horse instead, and rode in on that, and by all accounts she did the whole thing without losing her composure for a second. Then the days. There were plays, 5 of them in 5 nights, comedies by Plautus, in Italian translation, which was the newest and most fashionable entertainment in Europe. The Este were the family who invented modern Italian theatre, and they were showing off. And Isabella d'Este sat through all 5, and wrote home that they were extremely tedious, and there is a wonderful moment where she reports that everybody was so exhausted by the 4th night that the audience were falling asleep in their seats. Between the acts there were entertainments and moresche, danced interludes, and everybody remembered them, and nobody remembered the plays. There was a display of the trousseau formally, for the court to inspect. Her clothes were laid out and walked past. There was one gown that people wrote home about, and there was the famous string of pearls, and the whole point of the display was that the Borgias were not beggars. And there was the dancing. This is the part I want you to have. On one of the nights, Lucrezia Borgia got up and danced with her husband, and then she danced a Spanish dance with one of her own women, and the room stopped. Nobody at that court had seen it. Spanish dancing was not Italian dancing. It was faster and looser, and it had come to Rome with the Borgia household, and this Ferrarese court, which was the most cultivated in Italy, and had been sneering at Spaniards for a year, watched a girl of 21 dance, something they had never seen before, in the middle of their own festival, and the whole thing turned in that hour. The ambassadors wrote home about it. She dances tirelessly. She dances beautifully. Isabella d'Este, who could not bring herself to praise anything, conceded the dancing. She won that room with her feet, not with her family or her dowry or her father's threats, all of which had failed to make anybody like her. She got up and danced, and they liked her. Now the wedding night, because it is characteristic of that court and it is grim. Alfonso d'Este had not attended his own proxy wedding. He had come out to meet her on the road briefly, unannounced, in a manner that everybody found strange, looked at her, and gone away again. And on the night, the couple were put to bed with the whole apparatus of witnesses, and the following morning the report went out. Alfonso came out and told his father, in front of people, that he had found her pleasing. That is the sentence. That is what she got. She had crossed the Apennines in the snow with 1,000 people and danced a court into liking her and given 100,000 ducats to a family that had spent a year calling her a whore, and the verdict delivered to the assembled gentlemen of Ferrara the next morning was that he had found her pleasing. And then the festivities ended and everybody went home, and Isabella went back to Mantua, and the court emptied, and Lucrezia Borgia was left standing in a cold city in the marshes in February, with a husband who barely spoke to her, and a father-in-law who was already going through her household list with a pen, and the very first thing they did, within days of the last torch going out, was start sending her people home. Her Spaniards went first. Her women, the ones she had grown up with, the ones who spoke her language, the ones from Rome. Erlikel wanted a Ferrarese household round her, dependent, watchable, and he had waited politely until the guests were gone. She fought for them. There are letters, and she fought hard, and she lost most of it, and by the end of that first year, she was a young woman alone in a foreign city, with almost nobody left who had known her before. They had thrown her a week of plays and cannon, and she had danced them off their feet, and the moment the doors shut, they took her friends away one at a time. And there was one guest at that week of plays who had travelled a long way for the express purpose of not being impressed, and I have to give her a chapter of her own. Isabella d'Este is the other great woman of the Italian Renaissance, and she came back for that wedding for one reason, which was to look at her new sister-in-law and find her wanting, and she wrote it all down. And her letters are the funniest cruel documents of the century. Let me give her to you first, because she is magnificent and I want you to see them side by side. Isabella was Alfonso's sister, born in Ferrara, married at 16 to the Marquess of Mantua. She was the best educated lady in Italy, Latin, Greek, the classics, and she meant it. She was the greatest art collector of her age. She pestered Leonardo for a portrait for years and got a drawing out of him. She had a studiolo, a private room, filled with commissioned paintings on a program she designed herself, and she bullied the finest painters in Europe into supplying it. She governed Mantua when her husband was away, and when he was captured, she governed it better than he did, and his own people said so. She was, in other words, exactly the woman that the world was not supposed to be able to produce, and she had done it by force of will inside a marriage. And she was 6 years the elder, and she looked at what was coming into her mother's house, and she was implacable. The letters are extraordinary. She wrote to her husband from the wedding festivities. The voice of it is that of somebody at a party she is determined not to enjoy. She reports the entertainments as tedious. She notes with elaborate fairness that the bride danced well, and then adds something that takes it away. There is a passage about the wedding being cold and the whole thing being a bore. And there is one detail that I love, because it tells you everything about both of them. During the reception, the two women were seated together, and Isabella watched her all evening, and what she reported home was about the clothes, what she wore, what it cost, how the jewels compared with hers, whether her hair was as good as they said. They were rivals from the first hour, and they stayed rivals for 17 years. And the interesting thing is what the rivalry was actually about. It was not the husband. It was not even, really, precedence. Isabella d'Este built herself, brick by brick, out of scholarship and taste and sheer relentless quality. She was the most cultivated person in that family, and she had earned it. And into her house came a girl with no learning to speak of by Isabella's standards, no lineage anybody would admit to, a scandal in 3 chapters, and the most beautiful hair in Italy. And the poets went to Lucrezia. That is what did it. Ferrara's court, which had been Isabella's court in her girlhood, reorganized itself around the new duchess within a couple of years. Ariosto wrote for her. Bembo, the finest Latinist of the age, fell in love with her. The musicians came to her rooms. The Spanish songs, the dancing, the new poetry. It happened around Lucrezia, and it happened because people simply liked being near her, which is a gift you cannot acquire by application, and which Isabella d'Este, for all her Greek, did not have. Isabella was admired. Lucrezia was loved. And there is nothing on earth more infuriating. Now I want to be fair to her, because she is not a villain either, and I have been unkind. Isabella d'Este had every reason to be frightened of that marriage. The Borgias took things. That was the entire family business. Her brother's duchy was on Cesare's list. Everybody knew it. When Cesare took Urbino in 1502, he took it from Isabella's own sister-in-law and drove her out with nothing, and Isabella, who was a realist, wrote to Cesare and asked him for some of the looted statues. That is the world she was operating in. She was watching a family that 8 duchies marry into hers, and the new duchess was that family's ambassador in her mother's house. And when the Borgias fell, in 1503, and Cesare was finished, and the Pope was dead, and Lucrezia was suddenly a woman with no protector at all, in a court that had never wanted her. Isabella d'Este could have destroyed her. She did not. That is the part nobody tells. The 2 of them arrived over the years at something. Not friendship. The letters are never warm. But an accommodation, and then a working relationship, and there are letters between them at the end that are, if not affectionate, then perfectly decent. About children, about clothes, about a difficult husband they had in common opinions about. And when Lucrezia died, Isabella's own brother-in-law wrote to her about it, and the tone of that letter assumes she will care. 2 women, the most watched in Italy in one family, who did not like each other, and who were both in the end doing exactly the same thing, governing states for men who were away, keeping courts running, having babies, burying them, and being written about by men who had never done a day's work in their lives. Now, the poet, and he is the one piece of pure kindness in this entire evening. Pietro Bembo was 32 and the most elegant man in Italy, and he fell in love with the Duchess of Ferrara in the summer of 1503, and the letters survive, and Lord Byron came and looked at them 300 years later, and said they were the prettiest love letters in the world. Let me set it, because the timing is everything and nobody ever mentions the timing. The summer of 1503 is the worst summer of her life. In the August, in Rome, her father dies. In the same week, Cesare nearly dies of the same fever, and the whole Borgia enterprise, 10 years of murder and cunning and cities taken, collapses inside a month because the one thing it had all rested on was a 72-year-old man's heartbeat. And in the July before the news, she had lost a baby. She had been carried ill to a convent at Medellana in the countryside to recover, and she was 23, and she had a miscarriage, and she was very unwell. And that is where the love affair happens, in a convent. While she is recovering from losing a child, and then hearing that her father is dead and that her family no longer exists. Bembo was staying nearby. He was a Venetian, a scholar, a poet, the man who more or less invented modern literary Italian, and he had come to Ferrara because Ferrara was where the writers went. He came to visit her at Medellana. What happened between them was, I am fairly sure, almost entirely made of paper. The letters are extraordinary. They are in Italian and Spanish. She wrote to him in Spanish sometimes, which was the language of her childhood, and which almost nobody at that court could read, and that is a rather beautiful piece of privacy. They exchanged poems. He called her by a code name in his letters, because everybody's letters were read. He called her FF, and nobody has ever worked out what it stands for. They exchanged a book. She sent him a Spanish songbook of hers. He sent her a poem, and she sent him a lock of her hair. It is still there. It is in the Ambrosian Library in Milan, in a case, with the letters. Byron went and looked at it in 1816 and was so moved that he stole a single strand and wrote to a friend about it, and said the letters were the prettiest he had ever read. There is a bit of Lucrezia Borgia's hair in a library in Milan tonight, and it is still gold. Now, was it an affair? Almost certainly not, in the sense you mean. She was the Duchess of Ferrara, watched constantly. He was a guest of the family, and the letters themselves are, when you actually read them, the letters of a courtly love, which was a real and highly formal thing in that world, a game with rules, conducted in writing, in which a man of letters adores a great lady from a distance, and she permits it, and everybody understands that the adoration is the point, and not the prelude. But I do not think it was nothing either, and here is why. Look again at when it happened. Her father is dead, her brother is dying, and then broken, and then a prisoner. The family that made her, sold her, and defined her has ceased to exist in the space of about 8 weeks. She is 23 years old, in a foreign city, married to a man who did not want her, with a father-in-law who counts her candles, a sister-in-law reporting on her dresses, and no baby, and a man arrives who wants nothing from her. That is what Bembo was. He was not a treaty. He was not an alliance. He could not marry her, could not take anything from her, could not sell her to Milan. He simply thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and told her so in the best Italian anybody has ever written. She was 23, and it was the first time in her life a man had approached her without a contract. It ended quietly. He went away to Venice, to his career, and he became a cardinal in the end, which is delicious, and one of the most famous men in Europe. They wrote occasionally for years, and when she died, 16 years later, Pietro Bembo, then a very grand man indeed, wrote about her. And what he wrote was that with her he had lost the dearest thing he had in this life. He kept the hair. And I want to end this chapter with the thing that makes it a Ferrara story and not a romance, because there is a detail here that changes the shape of everything. Her husband knew. Alfonso d'Este was not a fool, and it was not a secret. Bembo was at his court, and nothing happened. There was no scene, no exile, no punishment. Alfonso, who was a blunt, physical, unliterary man who liked canon and disliked poets, watched the greatest writer in Italy write love letters to his wife and did precisely nothing about it, because it cost him nothing, and because it kept her happy, and because, by 1503, they had arrived at an understanding. That marriage is the most surprising thing in this evening, and we are going to have to deal with it, because a man who had refused her outright ended up, 17 years on, unable to write her name without breaking down. On the 18th of August, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died in Rome, and everything his family had built came apart inside 3 weeks, and his daughter was 200 miles away and was not told for days. He was 72. He and Cesare had both gone to a supper at a cardinal's villa outside the city in the August heat, and within days both of them were burning with fever, and the whole of Europe said poison at once and has said it ever since, that they had meant to poison their host and drunk the wrong cup. It was almost certainly malaria. August in Rome, in the marshes, in that century, killed people constantly, and the two of them had been out at a villa in the worst month of the year. But the legend needed the Pope of the poisoners to die of his own bottle, and so that is the story. He died badly. There is an account of the corpse, and I will not give it to you in detail because it is the sort of thing that has been used for 400 years to make a monster of a man who does not need any help. It was August, it was hot, and the body was in a bad state within hours, and the master of ceremonies wrote about it with real relish, and the Romans said it was the devil coming to collect. He was tumbled into a chest and pushed into a corner of St. Peter's, and later his bones were moved to a Spanish church, and there was no ceremony worth the name. And Cesare was in the next room, packed in ice or in a jar of cold water, depending on which account you read, so ill he could not stand, at the precise hour when the entire structure needed him on a horse. That is the whole Borgia enterprise in one image. 10 years of murder and cleverness, and taken cities, an army in the field, a new state half built, and it all depended on one old man's heart and one young man's health, and both failed in the same week. The papacy went to an enemy within 2 months. Julius II, the Della Rovere Pope, who had hated the Borgias for a decade and had been waiting in France for exactly this, came in and took every single thing Cesare had, and Cesare, who had outplayed everybody in Italy for 5 years, was outplayed once and lost the lot. He was arrested. He was shipped to Spain in irons. He escaped from a castle there down a rope and broke bones doing it, and got to Navarre and took service with the king there as a soldier, because it was all he had left, and in the March of 1507 he rode into an ambush at Viana and was killed in a ditch by men who did not know who he was. They stripped him of everything he had on and left him there. He was 31. Machiavelli's prince, the terror of Italy, the man who had a boy strangled in a bed for a change of alliance, was found in the mud with nothing on him now. Her. She was in Ferrara. She was 23, and the news came up the road to her in stages, and the letters that survive from that autumn are the worst reading in this entire story, because what you can see is a woman going quiet. She was ill already, from the miscarriage. She took it in bed, and then she got up and did the thing she always did, which was to work. Because look at her position, and this is where you understand exactly how alone she was. She was in a foreign city, in a family that had never wanted her, and the only reason they had taken her was her father. That was the entire basis of the marriage. The Pope's daughter, the Pope's dowry, the Pope's threat. And now the Pope was in a box in the corner of St. Peter's, and the new Pope hated her name. The dowry, incidentally, had never been fully paid. That is the exquisite detail. The Borgia still owed installments of it when Alexander died, and there was no Borgia left to pay. And so Lucrezia Borgia was sitting in Ferrara as a duchess in waiting with a dead father, a ruined brother, a hated surname, an unpaid bill, and a husband who had told his father he did not want her. They could have sent her back. It was discussed. There were people in that court who raised it. Get an annulment. The marriage is barely 2 years old. The consideration has failed. Send her to a convent and be done with the Borgias forever. They did not. Why not? Because of the 2 men in her life at that point, and this is the beginning of the second half of her école d'est. The mean old duke who had priced her by the item had by then been living with her for 2 years and had noticed in his careful way that she was extremely good. She ran her household properly. She did not overspend once she was given a budget. She was pious, which mattered enormously to him. She was charming to his people. He had bought a scandal and got an administrator, and even a man who counts candles can do that sum. And Alfonso, who had not wanted her, had by then been married to her for 2 years, and something had happened that nobody had planned for and nobody wrote down. He kept her at the exact moment when he could have got rid of her at no cost. With the church's blessing, with his family's approval, and half of Italy's applause, he did nothing at all, and she stayed, and she was his wife for another 16. Why? Nobody can say, because he was not a man who wrote about his feelings. So let me tell you who he actually was, because he is the one figure in this story that everybody skips. Alfonso d'Este is the most interesting husband in this evening, and hardly a soul has ever bothered with him, and I think the marriage between those two is the strangest love story of the Renaissance, precisely because neither of them ever said it was one. Take him as his own family saw him first, because they thought he was a disaster. He was the heir to the most cultivated court in Italy, and he was not cultivated. He did not care about poetry. He was not interested in Latin. His sister was the greatest collector of the age, and his father had built the theatre, and Alfonso liked guns. Not in the way that a prince is supposed to like war, at a distance with a marshal to do it. He liked the metal. He went down to the foundry and worked. He cast his own cannon with his own hands, and he was, by common consent, one of the best gunners in Europe, and the Ferrarese artillery, which he built himself, was the best in Italy, and saved that duchy more than once. And the court thought it was appalling. A duke with burnt hands and a leather apron. There is a whole strand of contemporary sniffing about it. He consorts with workmen. He smells of the forge. He has no conversation. He also, and I have to say this because it is true and because it is the other half of him, walked around Ferrara at night. There are reports of the Duke wandering the city after dark, alone, in ordinary clothes, and nobody quite knows what he was doing, and the polite theory is that he was inspecting his city, and the impolite one is the obvious one, and it does not matter much either way. The point is that he was a strange, solitary, physical, unliterary man who did not behave like a duke, and he was 24 and a widower when they made him marry the whore of Rome. Now, what actually happened between them? Because it is not a romance, and it is much better than one. The first 2 years were bad. Everybody says so. He was cold to her, he was away, he did not include her, and Ercole was grinding her down over money, and she was miserable and ill, and losing babies. In 1503, the correspondence is a young woman in a house where nobody talks to her, and then it changed, and it changed for a reason that has nothing to do with love, and that is exactly why it lasted. He watched her work. That is my reading of it, and I will defend it. Alfonso d'Este was a man who valued competence above every other quality, because he was a craftsman. He judged a cannon by whether it fired, and a person by whether they were any good. And this woman he had not wanted turned out to be extremely good. She ran the household properly. She kept accounts he could audit. And then, when he went off to the wars, which was constantly, he came back and found the duchy exactly as he had left it, because she had governed it competently, without fuss, and had not lost anything. He did that experiment for 15 years, and it came out the same way every time. That is what happened in that marriage. She did not charm him. She outperformed his expectations so consistently and for so long that a man who did not talk about feelings ended up unable to imagine the place without her. And here is the evidence that it went further than respect, and it is all circumstantial, and I find it overwhelming. He could have got rid of her in 1503 when her father died and the dowry was unpaid and the family was rubble. He did not. He watched the greatest poet in Italy write love letters to her and did nothing. He was, by every account, unfaithful. He had a long attachment to another woman late in life, and married her after Lucrezia died. There is not one report anywhere of a quarrel about it, which in that century, in that court with those ambassadors, is remarkable, and I think means the two of them had arrived at something honest. They had 6 or 7 children together, 9 or 10 pregnancies. Whatever else that marriage was, it was not distant. And when she died, the man who had refused to fetch her from Rome wrote that he could not put it on paper without crying, and called her the sweetest and dearest companion, and spoke of the tender love that was between them. There is one more thing he did, at the very end, and it is the piece of evidence I find most moving of all, and I'm going to save it, because it will mean nothing to you until you have seen the end. Nobody wrote a poem about that marriage. It is the only one in this evening that worked. And in the January of 1505, the old man finally let go of the duchy, and she became duchess, and then she went to work. So, Lucrezia Borgia became Duchess of Ferrara at 24, and then she did the work, and the work is the reason I wanted to give you this evening. Let me tell you what a Duchess of Ferrara actually did, because it is not what you think. Alfonso was a soldier. That was his whole nature. He loved artillery, and he cast his own guns in his own foundry with his own hands, which was considered an extraordinary and rather vulgar thing for a duke to do. And Ferrara in those years was at war more or less continuously, because Julius II decided to break it, and a small duchy in the middle of Italy with the papacy against it was fighting for its life for a decade. So Alfonso was away, constantly, for months at a time in the field at the guns, and every time he rode out he left his wife in charge, not as a figurehead, as the government. She held the authority. She signed. She sat with the council. She wrote to the other powers. And she did it over and over for 15 years. There is a body of documentation about it that nobody except specialists has ever read. The high point of it is 1512, and I want to give you that year properly. The French were the Este's allies, and the French had just fought the Battle of Ravenna, 25 miles from Ferrara, and won it and lost their commander doing it. And then the whole French position in Italy collapsed, and they went home over the Alps and left Ferrara alone in front of an enraged pope who had excommunicated her husband and wanted the duchy dissolved. Alfonso went to Rome to negotiate personally, which took nerve, and then had to run for his life and spent months getting home in disguise through hostile country. And Ferrara, for those months, was Lucrezia. She held it. She dealt with the Venetians. She managed the food. She kept a court and a city calm while its duke was missing, excommunicated, and probably dead for all anybody knew. And there is a marvellous document from that period, a letter to her from her husband's man, that treats her exactly as what she was, the acting head of a state at war. And she was pregnant at the time. She was almost always pregnant. Now, the other work, which is the part that has actually survived. The accounts. She kept them herself. There are ledgers in the Ferrarese archive in her hand and in her people's hands, and they are the reason we know what she was, because you cannot lie in a ledger. She ran the estates. She reclaimed marshland. That is a real thing she did, drainage projects out in the wet country, and she made money out of it. She invested. She lent money. She had, by the end, her own income, independent of her husband's, run out of her own properties, and when she died her brother-in-law wrote that she had left a good deal of money behind her, and nobody was quite sure how much. She had made herself financially independent inside a marriage in 1519. Let that sit for a moment. In the court. Ferrara under this duchess turned into one of the great courts of the Renaissance, and it turned, specifically, around her own rooms. Ariosto wrote the greatest poem of that century in that city and praised her in it. The printer Aldus was in the orbit of it, And the reason all of them were there is in the previous chapter. They went where the warmth was. And the charity, which she did not advertise, and which the ledgers show, she founded a hospital. She endowed convents. She took in her family's wreckage, her brother's illegitimate children, the boy from Rome, various Borgia cousins who had nothing after the fall, and she housed them and dowered the girls and found the boys places out of her own purse, quietly, for years. And she got in return the thing she had been chasing since she was 6 years old. She became respectable. I do not think we can quite feel what that meant to her. She had been the whore of Rome. Her name had been a joke in every court in Italy since she was 17. By about 1510, in that city, she was the Duchess. Pious, hard-working, good with money, kind to the poor, mother of the heir, and utterly beyond reproach. Nobody handed her that. She built it in 17 years, in a place that had jeered at her from the roadside on the day she arrived, in front of a father-in-law who had inspected her like livestock, and a sister-in-law who catalogued her dresses. And the way you know it worked is the way it ended, which we are coming to. And one more thing came out of those rooms, and it is the greatest poem in the Italian language. There is one more thing that came out of that court, and it is the greatest poem in the Italian language, and her name is in it. And I want to give it to you properly, because it is the only monument she has that is not a stone in a floor. Ludovico Ariosto was a Ferrarese, a civil servant, the son of a minor official, and he spent most of his working life doing jobs he hated for the Este family. He was sent on errands. He was made to govern a district up in the mountains full of bandits, which he loathed, and which he described in letters with a beautiful deadpan misery. He wanted, more than anything on earth, to be left alone in a room to write. And in among all that, for something like 30 years, he wrote Orlando Furioso, and it came out first in 1516, when she was 36 and living a few hundred yards away. It is enormous. It is knights and enchantresses and a hippogriff and a paladin, who goes mad for love and a journey to the moon to fetch back his lost wits. And it is funny, and it is beautiful, and it is fast, and for 300 years it was the most widely read secular book in Europe. Every writer you can think of loved it. It is the direct ancestor of every fantasy that has ever been written. And it was written in the same wet brick town, at the same time, in the same court, as the woman we have been sitting with all evening. He put her in it. There is a passage where the poet is shown a procession of the great women who are to come, and Lucrezia Borgia is among them, and the compliment he pays her is that she surpasses the Lucretia of ancient Rome. The old Lucretia, the Roman one, is the most famous chaste woman in classical literature, and her whole story is that she was forced against her will and then took her own life rather than live with it, and she is the byword, the standard, the name you invoke for a woman's honour. And Ariosto in 1516, in print, in the greatest poem of the age, took the woman whose name was a byword for filth in every court on the continent, and says she outdid Lucretia. Now, you can be cynical about that. He was on the payroll. Court poets praise the Duchess. That is what a court poet does, and half of that book is flattery of the Este with a plot wrapped round it. But I want you to hold two things next to each other. In 1516, Ludovico Ariosto put her in his poem as an emblem of virtue. In 1833, Victor Hugo put her in his play as a monster who poisons her own son. The man who wrote about her lived in the same town, in the same years, and saw her every week. The man who made her a monster had never been to Ferrara, and was writing 300 years after everybody involved was dead. And we believed the second one. That is the whole of it, really. That is the thing I have been trying to say all evening. Everybody who actually knew Lucrezia Borgia liked her. Every single one of them. Her father, her brother, her husbands after the first, her city, her poets, her nuns, her servants, the ambassador who was sent to spy on her, the sister-in-law who arrived, determined not to. The people who were actually in the room came away with the same answer, without exception, and everybody who has ever hated her did it from a very long way off. Now let me give you one ordinary day of hers, because we have done nothing but catastrophe so far. Most of her life was not catastrophe. It was a woman in a wet town getting on with it, and here is what that actually looked like. The city first. Ferrara is not Rome, and it is not Florence. It is flat. It sits in the Po Valley in country that is half water, and the mist comes off the marshes at night and lies in the streets until the middle of the morning, and in winter it does not lift at all. The air is damp and it gets into everything. The Este had drained a great deal of it, and there was always more to drain, and the mosquitoes in summer were simply a fact, and so was the fever they brought, and nobody knew the two were connected. But it was a modern city, and this is the part people miss. Ferrara in her lifetime was one of the first planned cities in Europe. Ercole had run a great extension across the north of it, with straight wide streets on a grid, which nobody in Italy had done since the Romans, and it was famous, and people came to look at it. So she lived in a place that was half medieval huddle and half brand new boulevard with brick everywhere, because there is no stone in that country, and everything is made of brick, and it is all warm red, and it is beautiful in a low, quiet way. And in the middle, the castle, a real one, square, with 4 towers and a moat with water in it, drawbridges, the lot. It had been built to defend the family from their own citizens after a rising, and it still looks like it. She woke in a room in that castle. Her apartments were on one side, and there is a good deal known about them. Painted ceilings, tapestry on the walls in winter, because brick sweats, a private chapel through a door, a room for the women, and, later, a small chamber she used for almost nothing but prayer. She heard Mass first, every day, and by the end of her life more than once a day. Then she dressed, and I am not going to pretend that was quick. There was a formal version and an ordinary version, and the ordinary version still involved several women, and the better part of an hour. And her hair, which was the whole operation, brushed out and dressed, and it went past her knees, and it took 2 people. She washed it herself on a set day, and the entire court knew which day it was and worked around it. Then the business of the morning, which is the part nobody puts in the paintings. She read letters. There were always letters. From Rome, from Mantua, from her agents on the estates, from her husband when he was away, from her sister-in-law who wanted something, from a convent that wanted money. She dictated the replies to a secretary and signed them herself. She saw her factor about the estates. That was a real meeting with real numbers. The properties out in the wet country, the drainage, the rents, what had come in and what had not. She did this personally for years, and the accounts prove it. She heard petitions. People came to the Duchess, a widow with no money, a man in a dispute, a convent with a leaking roof. She dealt with them, and the almsgiving went into the ledger, and she did the household. That court had hundreds of people in it, and they all had to be fed and paid, and their squabbles settled, and it was her office to do it. Dinner was the main meal, and it was in the middle of the day, and it was formal, in company, with musicians, and after it there was usually somebody who wanted something. The afternoon was for whatever the day contained. Sometimes she rode. Sometimes she was at one of the villas out in the country, which she liked, and where the air was better. Sometimes there was a plague or a war, and she was in the room with the council instead, and in the evening her rooms filled up, and this is the bit I would have liked to see. The poets came. Ariosto, who worked for her brother-in-law and read them things he was writing. Musicians. She kept Spanish singers for years, and they sang the songs of her childhood in a language nobody else in that city spoke. There was dancing, still, into her 30s. There were her women, who by then were Ferrarese Roman and Spanish mixed, and there were the children when they were small, and the strays she had gathered, her brother's daughters, the boy from Rome. That is what she built. Not a salon in the pompous sense, just the warm room in a cold city, a place where people wanted to be in the evening. And when they all went, and it was quiet, and the mist was in the street outside, she went through the accounts. That is the image I want to leave you with, honestly, more than any of the rest of it. A woman of 35 in a brick castle in a marsh town, in a Franciscan habit under her gown, with her hair down, alone at last, at a table, with a candle, going through the numbers column by column in her own hand, making sure they came out, 10 pregnancies, 2 poets in love with her. A father who sold her 3 times, a brother who murdered her husband, a son dead at 12 in a house she had never seen, and half of Europe telling each other she was a poisoner. And the ledgers balanced, right up to the fortnight she died in. Now, the hard part, and there is no way round it. I want to give you the babies, because we have gone past them very fast, and they are, in the plainest terms, what killed her. And no account of this woman is honest without them laid out in a row. Here is the list, as near as anybody can reconstruct it. Rodrigo. In Rome, in 1499, when she was 19 he lived. He is the one who died at 12 in Bari, then Ferrara, a daughter stillborn in the September of 1502 when she was 22. She was very ill afterwards. She had a fever for weeks, and she was bled repeatedly, which was the treatment, and which very nearly finished her. And there is a report of her father in Rome being unable to conduct business because of the news. A miscarriage in the July of 1503, at the convent in the country, in the weeks before her father died. Alessandro, in 1505. He lasted a couple of months. Ercole, in 1508. He lived. He became Duke. Ippolito, in 1509. He lived. He built the fountains. Alessandro again, in 1514, named for the brother they had lost. And, I have always thought, for her father, he lasted 2 years. Leonora, in 1515. She grew up and went into a convent and stayed there. Francesco, in 1516. He grew up too, a miscarriage or a stillbirth around 1518. The record is unclear. And Isabella Maria, in the June of 1519, far too early, which killed her. That is 10 at least, probably 11, in 20 years, of which 4 sons and a daughter grew up. Now let me tell you what that actually was, because a list is not the thing. She was pregnant, on and off, from 18 to 39. There is barely a stretch of 2 years in that whole span where she was not either carrying, recovering, or grieving, and the recoveries got worse. After the stillbirth of 1502, she was ill for months, and they bled her from the foot, and there is a description of Cesare Borgia, the terror of Italy, coming to Ferrara and sitting on his sister's bed and holding her while they cut her, and making her laugh through it, because she was frightened. I have to give you that, because it is the only glimpse of the 2 of them together that is not about politics. He had her husband strangled, and he sat on her bed and held her hand, while the surgeons worked and talked to her until she was calm. People are not one thing. That is the whole difficulty of this family. And then look at what a confinement in that century meant. There was no pain relief. There was no antisepsis. Nobody had any notion of it. The single greatest killer of women of childbearing age in Europe was childbed fever, and it was carried in on the hands of the people helping. A woman going into a birth in 1500 was doing something with a real chance of death. And she knew it, and everyone in the room knew it, and they said the prayers before, not after, and she did it 10 times, and every single one of them was, in the strictest sense, work. That was the job. The Duchess of Ferrara was there to produce Este's sons, and until she had produced enough of them, she was not safe, and she knew that too. Read the letters from that court around a birth. The whole apparatus is waiting. The ambassadors are writing home. Mantua wants to know, and the news that goes out is not. She is well. It is a boy. She got the boys. She got 4 of them, in the end, and one of them ruled, and one of them built the most beautiful garden in Italy, and having got them, she went on being pregnant anyway, because that is what a wife was. And it killed her at 39, and everybody at the time thought this was sad and ordinary, and it was both. There is one letter I want you to have. When her son Rodrigo died in 1512, she wrote to her husband about it, and it is very short and very controlled, and she says that she wishes to withdraw for a while to grieve, and asks his permission. She asked permission to be sad. He gave it. That is the only decent thing in the paragraph. But she had to ask, and she wrote it out in her own hand and sent it up the road to a man in a tent somewhere, formally, with the correct salutation, "My son is dead. May I please be allowed to mind?" That is what her life actually was. Not poison, not a ring, not a hollow jewel at a dinner party. A ledger, a duchy, 10 pregnancies, 5 graves, a habit under her clothes, and a note asking whether she might be permitted to grieve. And in the middle of all of it, there was one man left to tell you about, and he was the only thing in her whole life that nobody had arranged for her. There is one more man, and I have left him until now on purpose, because he is the one who complicates the picture, and he was married to Isabella d'Este. Francesco Gonzaga was the Marquess of Mantua. He was a soldier, one of the best condottieri in Italy, small and dark and ugly by the standards of the day and famous for it. There is a portrait, and he has an enormous nose and a heavy lip, and the whole face of a man who has been kicked by a horse and got up again. He was brave, coarse, popular with his men, and by every account absolutely magnetic, and he was Isabella's husband, which makes what follows either the most delicious thing in this evening or the saddest, depending on where you stand. He and Lucrezia had known each other for years, formally. He had been at her wedding. He was the brother-in-law. They were correspondents in the ordinary way of 2 Italian courts. And then in about 1508 it became something else, and it went on for years. The evidence is letters. They wrote to each other in cipher. They used a code name for her, Barbara, and they wrote through a go-between, a churchman who carried the correspondence and who was, by the tone of it, thoroughly enjoying himself. And the letters, when you read them, are not courtly love in the Bembo sense. They are warmer and rougher and more like 2 people who have been badly hurt and have found somebody who understands. Was it physical? Possibly. There is not a scrap of proof. They were in the same place rarely. Mantua is 30 miles from Ferrara. Both of them were watched by everyone. The rumour at the time was that it was, and the rumour at the time about her was always the worst available version, so I discount it as a matter of course. But something was going on for years, and both of their spouses almost certainly knew. Now, what makes it interesting? Look at the 2 of them. He was married to Isabella d'Este, brilliant, exacting, better educated than him, better at politics than him, and quite plainly the more able of the pair. That marriage was a partnership, and it worked, and it was also, I suspect, exhausting to be inside, because Isabella never stopped being right. And Francesco was captured by the Venetians in 1509 and held in a cell for a year, and it broke him. He came out ill and diminished, and he had the French disease, which was running through the courts of Italy in that generation and which killed him in the end, slowly and horribly, and he knew what was coming. And Isabella meanwhile governed Mantua while he was in that cell, and governed it better than he had, and everybody said so, including the Venetians. When he came out, he was, in a small way, redundant in his own state, and his wife had proved it. So here are two people. A woman who has been sold 3 times, whose family is destroyed, whose son is dead, married to a man who does not talk, and a man who has been broken in a cell and outshone by his own wife, and knows he is dying of something shameful. And they wrote to each other in code for years, and I do not think it needs to have been an affair to have been the most important thing in either of their weeks. Now, the ending, and it is the part that made me include this chapter. Francesco Gonzaga died in 1519. In the March, Lucrezia Borgia died 3 months later, in the June. She was pregnant when he died. She was carrying the child that killed her, and she got the news that he was gone, and she had about 90 days left. And Isabella d'Este outlived both of them by 20 years and governed Mantua for her son, and became, in her widowhood, the most respected woman in Italy and the greatest collector in Europe. And I do not for one moment think she wasted a night's sleep over any of it, and that is not coldness on her part. That is a woman who had worked out very early what a marriage was for. 3 people. One is the greatest patron of the age, and dies in her bed full of years with the finest collection in Europe. One is a soldier who dies of what he caught in the wars. And one is a woman who was sold at 13 and who at 38 in a marsh town in cipher, under a false name through a priest, had one relationship in her entire life that nobody had arranged for her. That is what she had to do to have something of her own, a code name and a go-between. But that is the end, and there are 7 years to go before it, and they begin with the worst letter she ever received. It came up from Naples in the summer of 1512, and it told her that her son was dead. Rodrigo of Aragon died in the August of 1512, at Bari at 12, and his mother had not seen him for 10 of those, and this is the thing that broke her. Let me tell you what happened to that child, because it is the cruelest arithmetic in this whole evening. He was her son by Alfonso of Aragon, born in the November of 1499, the baby the Pope carried around Rome. He was 8 months old when his father was strangled. He was 2 when his mother left Rome forever, and she could not take him. That is the fact. Ferrara would not have him. He was the son of a Neapolitan prince. He had a claim to a duchy in the south, and he was a Borgia grandchild with a murdered father, and Ercole d'Este was not going to have that boy in his house as a standing reminder of everything he had married into. There was a negotiation about it, and she lost it, and I do not know what that negotiation was like, and I would give a great deal to. So on the 6th of January 1502, when she rode out of Rome for the last time with 1,000 people and the pearls, she left her 2-year-old son behind her in that city. He was given to his aunt Sancia, and then, when Sancia died, he was passed on again to another relation, and he ended up in the south at Bari, in the household of a Neapolitan duchess, being brought up by people his mother had to write to. She provided for him, that is documented, and it matters. She had property assigned to him, she wrote about his affairs, she sent money, she arranged things, and there is correspondence about his household running the whole 10 years. She never let go of the administration of that child's life. She just never saw him again. 10 years, from 2 to 12. She was 60 miles from Rome and then 200, and she was the Duchess of Ferrara, and she could not have her own son in her own house, and I have never read an adequate explanation of why she did not simply fight for it, except the obvious one, which is that she had no power at all in that family, and had spent every ounce of credit she had on staying in it. And in the August of 1512, at Bari, the boy died. Nobody records of what. He was 12, and Lucrezia Borgia stopped. That is the shape of it, and every account agrees. From 1512 she withdraws. She goes quiet. She spends less time at court and more in her own rooms and at the convents outside the city. She takes to religion in a way that is not the ordinary piety of that world, but something else. She becomes a Franciscan tertiary, which is a lay order, a way of living under a rule while remaining in the world, and she took it seriously. She wore the habit under her clothes. She is said to have worn a hair shirt at the end, and the descriptions of her change. She thickens. She looks older than she is. There are references to spells of deep sadness, which is as close as that century ever gets to naming it. She was 32. Now, I want to be careful, because there is a temptation to make this a single clean tragedy, and it was not clean. It was a pile-up. Look at what that decade had done to her by 1512. Her father dead in a hot room in Rome, her brother Juan in the Tiber, her brother Cesare dead in a ditch in Spain at 31. Her second husband strangled, her first husband alive and telling Europe she was a monster, her family's name a byword, a string of babies dead at birth or a few days after, and now the one child of the one man she had loved, dead at 12, in a house she had never visited, hundreds of miles away. That is what was in that woman when she was 32 years old, and she had 7 years to go. And what she did with those 7 years is the part I most want you to have. She did not collapse. She went on governing. The ledgers keep running. The drainage schemes go on. The letters are still going out. When her husband is away, she is still holding the duchy. She is still doing the accounts in 1518. She is still writing about grain and money and a marriage for one of Cesare's daughters. She just did it in a Franciscan habit, from a smaller set of rooms with the door to the convent left open. There is one letter from the end of her life that I want to give you, and it is to a pope, of all people, and it is the only time she ever wrote to Rome about her own soul. She wrote to Leo X in 1519, asking for a blessing, and she said that she had for some time turned away from the vanities of the world, and that she now thought of nothing but how to serve God, and she asked for absolution. The daughter of Alexander VI, writing to a Medici pope, asking to be forgiven. She was 39 when she wrote it, and she was pregnant again for the 9th or 10th time, and she had about a fortnight to live. On the 14th of June 1519, Lucrezia Borgia gave birth to a daughter 2 months early, and the child was baptized at once, because nobody expected her to last the night, and it was the mother who died 10 days later at 39. Here is the end, and I am going to do it plainly, because it does not need any decoration. The pregnancy had been hard from the start. She was 39. She had been pregnant most years since she was 18, and she had never really recovered from the last one. She was ill through the spring. She was carried out to the country and brought back. There is a fever mentioned, and swelling, and she could not keep food down. It happened in the night, in the castle, and the child was small and weak and, some accounts say, blind, and they christened her Isabella Maria within the hour, because a child who dies unbaptized in that world was a horror no one would risk. And her mother did not stop bleeding, or did not stop burning, and after 10 days it was clear. Her hair was cut off. That is one of the details that stays with me. They cut her hair, the famous hair, past her knees, gold, the thing she had washed herself since she was a girl and stopped a procession for, and it went, because it was in the way of the nursing, and because she did not care any more. She had the last rites. She asked for the sacrament and had it. She was in the Franciscan habit, or they put her in it. and on the 22nd of June she dictated a letter to the Pope. It is not long. She tells him that after a long and difficult illness she has given birth, and that she does not think she will recover, and she says she is about to give her soul to God, and she asks for his blessing on herself, and on her husband, and on her children. And there is a phrase near the end where she says that as a Christian she wishes to make him a participant in her belief. She is a dying woman being polite to a Medici about the state of her soul. It is the last thing she ever wrote, and it is a formal letter, and even at the very end she was working. She died on the 24th of June, 1519. She was 39 years and 2 months old. Now the husband, and this is the reason I have been building to it all evening. You know what he was. You know he had refused her, and been made to take her, and had not gone to Rome himself. And this is what he wrote when she died. He wrote to his nephew, and he said that he could not write it without tears. So hard was it for him to find himself deprived of such a sweet and dear companion, for her good ways, and for the tender love that was between them. Such a sweet and dear companion. The tender love that was between us. That is a soldier who cast his own guns and disliked poets and did not write about his feelings in his own hand on the day, and it is the plainest and most complete refutation of the entire Borgia legend that exists. 17 years. She was handed to that man against his will in a city that had come out to jeer at her with the worst reputation in Europe, and by the end of it he could not put the news on paper without crying. The city closed. That is documented too. Ferrara shut its shops and its people came out and they mourned her, and the man from Mantua, who had been sent to observe, wrote home that he had never seen a city so stricken, and their grandparents had lined that same road in the snow to look at the whore of Rome. And here is the last thing, and it is the thing I have been holding all evening. They found her account books afterwards, and they were in order. She was dying for 10 days, and the ledgers were up to date. That is the woman. That is the poisoner with the ring, a Franciscan tertiary with a hair shirt on, and a set of balanced accounts and a duchy she had been governing for 15 years, dead at 39 of the 9th or 10th pregnancy that anybody had asked her about her opinion of exactly none of. Now let me finish the family, because everybody in this evening has an ending, and one of them will make you sit up. Let me finish the family. They all have endings, some of them astonishing, and one will make you sit up. Her son's first, Ercole, the eldest survivor, took the duchy after his father and held it for 1/4 of a century, and he married Renee of France, who was a king's daughter and a serious Protestant, and Ferrara, under Lucrezia Borgia's son, became, for a while, a refuge for reformers, and John Calvin himself came and stayed there under a false name. Read that again. Alexander VI's grandson, ruling a duchy that sheltered Calvin. Ippolito II went into the church, because a second son did, and became a cardinal, and he was the one who built the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, the one with the water, the 100 fountains, the water organ, the whole ridiculous, glorious hillside of it. It is one of the most beautiful places in Italy, and people go there every day of the year, and almost none of them know that the man who built it was Lucrezia Borgia's son. And the daughter, everybody assumed she would not. She outlasted her mother by the better part of 2 decades, and married and had a life of her own. The child who killed her survived her. Then the ones she gathered up. Giovanni, the infans Romanus, the boy from Rome, whose paternity nobody could agree on, grew up in her household in Ferrara as her half-brother, and got to about 50, and died in the 1540s as an ordinary Italian gentleman of no importance. Nobody ever asked him, or if they did, he never said. Zere's daughter, Louise, was raised in France by her French mother, His illegitimate children were taken in by Lucrezia and provided for out of her own money. There is a girl among them she found a husband for and paid for. And Caesar's line, such as it was, disappeared inside 2 generations. The most feared man in Italy, the man who murdered his own brother-in-law, and possibly his own brother, left nothing at all. That whole enterprise, 10 years of blood, produced not 1 acre that stayed in the family. Now, the rest of them. Giovanni Sforza, the first husband, the man who was made to sign that he was impotent, went home to Pesaro and married again, a 3rd time, and had a son, and thus proved in the plainest possible way that the document he had signed was a lie. He got his little town back after Cesare fell, and he ruled it for 6 more years and died in 1510. His son died at 10. His line ended with him too. Vanozza, the mother, outlived nearly all of them. She was 76 at the end, in 1518, 12 months before her daughter, still running her inns, still endowing her chapels. She had buried Juan and Cesare, and she watched Lucrezia be sold 3 times, and there is not 1 letter of hers that survives, not 1, which I think about a great deal. The most important woman in the early life of the most notorious woman in Europe, and we do not have a single word in her voice. Julia Farnese kept out of the light and was gone at 49, and her brother took the papacy, and her family held a duchy for 2 centuries off the back of what she did at 15. Isabella d'Este outlived everybody, as she was always going to, and went in 1539, and if you have ever seen the Mantegnas in the Louvre, you are looking at her furniture. Pietro Bembo became a cardinal, and the arbiter of the Italian language, and lived to 76, and kept the hair. And Alfonso, the husband, outlived her by a dozen years, and fought off 2 popes with the guns he cast himself, and remarried, and there is one more thing he did, which I promised you, and which comes last. Now the last thing, the tomb. They put her in the convent of Corpus Domini, in the habit, where she asked to be, and time did what time does. Ferrara stopped being a great court. The Este line moved to Modena, the convent went on being a convent, and the stone in the floor of that little church was walked over for 400 years by nuns who mostly did not know. She is still there. It is a small, quiet, plain place, and you can go, and there are almost never any tourists in it, and there is a stone with her name on it and the dates. And Alfonso is beside her. That is the thing I saved. He could have gone anywhere. The Dukes of Ferrara were buried in state, in the great churches, with marble and inscriptions, and the whole apparatus of a 300-year-old house. And when his time came, the man who had refused to fetch her from Rome, who had been forced at 24 to marry a woman whose name was a joke in every court in Europe, gave instructions that he was to be carried out to a nun's chapel on the edge of town and laid in the plain place she had chosen for herself. 2 of her sons are there as well, and a granddaughter. The whore of Rome, the poisoner, the monster of the operas, is lying under the floor of a nun's chapel in a market town in the Po Valley with her husband beside her, exactly where she asked to be put, and every year still people leave flowers on it. Nobody organizes that either. So how did a woman who ended like that become the most notorious poisoner in the history of Europe? It is worth doing properly, because the answer is a machine, and the machine is still running, and it has been used on very nearly every woman worth knowing about in that century. It happened in 4 stages. Stage 1, in her lifetime, was the personal. 1 divorced husband, humiliated into signing a paper saying he was impotent, said the Pope wanted her for himself. That is it. That is the seed. 1 sentence from one furious man in 1497. And it stuck because there was an appetite for it. and the appetite was national. The Italians hated the Spaniards, and here was a Spanish family in the chair of St. Peter, and any stick would do. Stage 2 was the professional. After Alexander died, the new pope was Julius II, who had spent a decade in exile hating the Borgias, and there was a period in which saying terrible things about that family was not merely permitted, but was a way of getting a job. And the men who wrote the histories of the next generation wrote them in that climate, and they were not being paid to be careful. Stage 3, and this is the big one, is the Protestants. Think about the timing. Lucrezia dies in 1519. 2 years later, Luther is excommunicated, and Northern Europe is looking for the proof that Rome is corrupt. And there it is, handed to them. A pope who bought his election, kept a mistress, had 4 children, and married his daughter off 3 times. You could not invent a better exhibit if you tried, and 400 years Protestant polemic in England and Germany used Alexander VI as the single most useful fact in the argument, and his daughter came along in the parcel. Every English schoolchild was taught the Borgias for the same reason they were taught Bloody Mary, which is that it was useful. And stage 4 is the 19th century, and this is where the ring arrives. The Romantics found her. Victor Hugo wrote a play in 1833 called Lucrezia Borgia, and it was a sensation, and it was completely fictional. Incest, poison, a monstrous woman destroyed by her own crimes. Donizetti turned it into an opera the next year, which is still performed. And that is where the poison ring comes from. It comes from a French play. It is younger than the steam engine, and then it became a fact, the way things do, by being repeated by people who did not check. Now, watch the shape of it, because this is why I keep coming back to this family. 4 charges, 4 sources, an angry ex-husband, a hostile administration, a religious argument, and a novelist. Not one witness, not one document, not one victim with a name, and every one of those charges is about her body. Not one of them is about her governance, or her accounts, or her diplomacy, or the 15 years she spent running a duchy. Nobody ever accused Lucrezia Borgia of being a bad administrator, because nobody could, because she was an excellent one, and it would not have been interesting anyway. It is the same weapon every single time. Anne Boleyn, adultery with 5 men including her brother, on impossible dates invented, and she died of it. Juana of Castile, her mind invented, and she was locked in a room for 46 years. Catherine of Aragon, her virginity, argued about by a room of men for the best part of a decade. Elizabeth Tudor, a lawyer's pamphlet about her womb, and she took his hand off for it. And Lucrezia Borgia, a hollow ring, a father, a brother, and 3 centuries of opera. When you want to destroy a woman with power, you do not go at the power. You go at the body, because the body is the thing everybody will repeat. And it works. It worked so well on this one that 5 centuries on, an intelligent person who has never read a word about her can still tell you she was a poisoner. Now let me tell you what she actually was, and then we can put her to bed. She was a girl who was sold at 13, at 18 and at 21, by a father who adored her. She warned one husband and saved his life, and he repaid her by ruining her name. She loved a second and nursed him for a month, and cooked his food with her own hands, and they strangled him anyway. She governed a papal city at 19. She opened the correspondence of the Holy See. She was widowed at 20, and signed a letter, once the unhappiest of women, and never complained again in writing for the rest of her life. She arrived at 21 in a city that came out to jeer, and she governed that city for 15 years while its duke was at the guns, and reclaimed its marshes, and kept its accounts, and paid for its poets, and endowed its convents, and buried most of her children in it. And when she died, the man who had refused to fetch her wept, and Ferrara closed its shops, and the finest writer in Italy said he had lost the dearest thing he had. That is what the poisoner did with her life. And there is that lock of hair in its case in Milan, 500 years. And the thing that survives, out of everything, is not the ring, because the ring never existed. It is a piece of a woman's hair which she cut off and sent to a man who loved her and wanted nothing from her, in the worst months she ever lived through, when her father was dead and her family was over and she was 23 in a foreign country, and somebody, at last, was kind to her. And now let her rest, because nobody let her rest for 500 years. And tonight we can let Rome go quiet first, let the heat come off the stones at last, and the Tiber run dark and slow under the bridges, and the alleys empty, and the great palaces put out their lamps one by one. There is nobody in the river tonight. Nobody is being carried anywhere. The steps of St. Peter's are bare, and there is no one lying in wait among the beggars, and the doors of the Vatican are shut, and the whole of that hot, loud, dangerous city is asleep. Let Pesaro be a small town on the sea. Let the boats knock together in the harbour, and the hill behind the castle go blue in the dark, and let a girl of 15 sit at her window in a house she keeps well, in a marriage that has not gone wrong yet, listening to the water. Let the road north be empty. No 1,000 people, no snow, no wagons, no jewels in boxes on the backs of mules, no SD brothers riding beside her writing letters home about how slowly she goes. Just a road through the mountains in January with no one on it. And let Ferrara be still. It is a low city in flat, wet country, and the mist comes in off the marshes at night and lies in the streets. And there is a castle with water round it. Somewhere in that castle the ledgers are shut and the candles are out, and the accounts are balanced to the last soldo. The poets have gone to bed. The guns in her husband's foundry are cold. And out at the edge of the city there is a convent where the nuns are, and it is very plain, and there is a stone in the floor. She is 39. She has been asleep there for 500 years, in the habit she asked for, next to a man who did not want her and could not write the news of her death without crying. Nobody is coming to sell her to anybody. There is no contract being drawn up in another room. No one is going to make her stand in front of a table of cardinals and answer questions about her own body, or make her dance for the men from Ferrara, and no one is ever going to take another child out of her arms. And in a library in Milan there is a small case with a lock of gold hair in it, and it is dark in there tonight too, and the hair is exactly as it was on the day she cut it off and sent it to somebody who was kind to her. Rest now. She has done the work. The books are straight, the duchy is quiet, and there is nothing left for her to hold. If tonight was good company, there is more of it, and you are very welcome to come along for the next one, and then it will find you when you would like it. And if you want to leave a word behind you before you go, I do love reading them, or whatever the hour happens to be on your side of the world. Thank you for these hours. I have liked them very much. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.